Chapter 2306. Although it was the Taoist's first time here, for a cultivator of his level, it was easy for him to find someone. After 7 or 8 turns, he arrived at a spacious workshop behind a shop. There were many people here. It seemed that there were craftsmen, chi refining, and foundation establishment cultivators. In front of a workbench, a guy wearing a leather apron was boasting. Why is it that there are people who don't touch the pot but don't touch the toilet? This is a very complicated question. The Taoist laughed. As always, he was unconventional and would never change. This was his friend. The toilet wasn't a new thing in the 5-ring world. It was invented as early as 20,000 years ago. It had been difficult to popularize on a large scale because it had very high requirements for the construction of houses. There was also a comprehensive consideration of water, sewer, and sewage. Generally, only the rich and powerful would use it. But no matter how slow it was, it would still slowly spread because it made the toilets of the past no longer as good-looking, smelling, and looking. Humans always yearned for a better life. Today, 20,000 years later, the toilet was no longer a rare thing in large cities. It had also begun to enter the residences of tens of thousands of households. Of course, it was limited to the middle class and above. Especially in Xianyuan City, where the management was strict, orderly, clean, tidy, and there was no shortage of water, the popularity of the toilet was higher than in other cities. Although it wasn't possible to install it in every household because the water and sewer systems were too complicated, it was still possible to do it in public toilet. It should be known that these things were originally stored in buckets at home and collected every morning. It had a big impact on the image of the city. The apron man nodded at him from afar and continued to talk nonsense. The most unpleasant experience in public toilets is to deal with the traces left behind by the previous guests. The solidity of their adhesion to the ceramic surface was something that even glue could not compare to. In order to avoid this embarrassment, we can study anti-ergonomic technique. How to make the feces fall vertically into the water, but this brings about the problem of splashing water. Solving the problem of sticky feces in buckets, in addition to improving our toilet experience, has a more important significance: water conservation. I hope that you will put your rich experience and knowledge into this very meaningful creation. I've already talked about the specific direction, but it may not be comprehensive. It still needs everyone's efforts. But before that day comes, we can only continue to practice the splash holding technique. After the apron man finished his lecture, he turned to the new Taoist. Fellow Taoist, about the problem of not touching the pot, how do you solve it? The Taoist's words were sarcastic. You can poop in the pot. Laughing loudly, the man in the apron walked over and stretched out his hand. His dirty hand had already left a mark on the Taoist's clean Taoist robe. Nothing was left? Taoist's robes had a self-cleaning function. The man in the apron turned to the others and shouted, "That's right, we don't have to focus on the problem of materials. We can discuss with the 3 pure ones later, and ask them to make a simple cleaning array. The Taoist is the Taoist is Taoist have a Taoist ist Taoist deist Taoist ist Taoist was hopeless Taoist in the future. I'm afraid you'll be the only one who can patrol the skies of the 5th ring. Lu Xiaoyi was very sharp. I alone am enough. You should have left long ago. There's no need to waste time here with me. However, I still wanted to know. Was he forced to leave? Because of the request of your universe's 3 clear Tao sects? Qing Xian sighed. A person who always talked about shit and urine all day long had a terrifying intuition when it came to judging things. He only needed one sentence, and this person could guess the cause and effect. The 3 pure ones have a general plan. There is a first and a second, a master and a second, a test and a ban. 20 years ago, they came to inform me, and I found an excuse. But this time, I'm afraid I can't avoid it. If I don't go, the universe's 3 Pure Ones Alliance will have opinions about the 5 rings 3 Pure Ones, Lu Xiaoyi smiled. Understood. It was a big house after all. In fact, if you ask me, you don't have to be so petty about it. I really don't have anything to do, so I'll stay here for a while longer. If there's really something important, I'll also arrange for some people to keep an eye on it. It's best if there's nothing. If there's something, we'll meet again. It's not like you can't come out just because you set up the Tao tablet. Qing Xian nodded. Your intuition, especially towards disasters, is incredible. It seems like you've never been wrong before? Actually, in my opinion, saving the mother planet is the most important thing, but it's also very practical to get some fated chances from doing this with you. Unfortunately, I'm afraid you'll have to eat it all by yourself again this time. Lu Xiaoyi laughed loudly. That's the truth. Weren't my abilities forced out by them in this way? My original dream was just to be a simple Dharma cultivator who could cast dazzling spells. In the end, I was forced to do this. Sigh, what a pity for my invincible talent in sorcery. Qing Xian also laughed. Then should our Dharma lineage thank these people? Otherwise, who knows what kind of disaster the Dharma cultivator circle would have become because of you. I won't be back when I leave this time. You know how to contact me. I'll just say one thing, we're all friends. Don't eat all the benefits and fated chances alone. Since you've eaten the meat, you should at least let us eat the bones and drink the soup, right? Qing Xian left. Lu Xiaoyi understood what he meant. What opportunity! It was just a joke. The important thing was that he did not have to shoulder it alone. Since he had these friends, it would be easier for everyone to bear it together. This was the meaning of friends. He didn't want to bear it alone. The key was that damn intuition and that warning. He had no clue at all. He didn't know where the danger came from and where the change would come from. When the sword fell, it wasn't scary. What was worse was the feeling of it hanging above his head. It made him uneasy and shocked. There were tens of billions of living beings. Even if he was as strong as a half-immortal, he couldn't be calm. This was a necessary sense of responsibility. There weren't many people who believed in his intuition. Qing Xian was probably the most resolute one among them. This was because they had known each other for the longest time. Their mutual trust was cultivated through countless battles. In this aspect, even senior apprentice sister Yan Qing couldn't compare. But he couldn't explain it, especially when he had spent 15 years and spent a lot of money. He had mobilized tens of thousands of people. He could only use a groundless planet duel as an excuse. Intuition and reality. When you couldn't prove your intuition with reality, no matter how hard you tried, you could only submit to reality. Now that he was here, the number of people who were going to calculate the celestial phenomena before the 5th ring doubled. This was already the best he could do. People had to live a normal life and cultivate. You couldn't use a completely illusory threat to keep everyone on edge all the time. Even if he still insisted that it could happen. Chapter 2307. Lu Xiaoyi once again increased the intensity of his detection of the environment outside the 5th ring. Originally, he would stay in the 5th ring for 2 out of 3 years and go out for 1 year. Now, it had been changed to a cycle of 2 years. He would return to the mountain for 1 year and go out for 1 year. Although Lu Xiaoyi had never asked for anything, the group of young true immortals under his command also began to learn from him. 1 year of self-cultivation and the other year of exploration. Light, Radiance, Yendai, Songrong, Zofan, Handang, and more than 10 other Xianyuan Yang gods and primordial spirits were the core of the next generation of Xianyuan sword school. They were also Lu Xiaoyi's most ardent supporters. If he dared to run naked on the dome, these people would dare to line up to follow him. To them, there was no such thing as face or hypocrisy. This was because they were different from the old guy's fixed thinking. They were the biggest beneficiaries of his sword system, Tao realm system, and cultivation philosophy. They firmly believed that Lu Xiaoyi's direction was the direction of the new era in the future. Among them, Yan Dai was the most meticulous. Based on the principle of strength in numbers, she had started a brand new cultivation course decades ago, the study of the fifth ring's trajectory. This wasn't a combat skill or a cultivation skill. It was a completely independent theory of the universe's celestial bodies that studied the trajectory of the fifth ring alone. The main point was that when large domains moved through the void of the universe, the surrounding astronomical phenomena produced a reaction force and a reaction force. This theory had an impact on the trajectory of the fifth ring. It was a purely academic topic. One could imagine how unpopular such a topic was in Xianyuan, where battle was an instinct. Almost no one participated. Only Supremes Yuanying, big and small, were there. They were mainly supporting her out of politeness because of Yan Dai's personal charm. After a few years, Yan Dai was also somewhat discouraged. This was because almost no one participated in the activities. They were just slackers who didn't do anything practical. However, she had a stubborn personality. This could be seen from her experience of climbing all the way from the lower 3 stars. Faced with such a predicament, her response was to expand the scope of the subject. Weren't Supremes and Yuanying not interested? Then let's lower the threshold and let Jin Dan cultivators have a chance to participate. This was truly a stroke of genius. For those Jin Dan who were filled with longing for the void of the universe and hated that they could not participate, they had already gained a forward-looking understanding of the void beyond the universe through various means. To their cultivation, this might be meaningless, but you could never stop a cultivator from being curious about the future and the universe. Even mortals were filled with thoughts of outer space, let alone cultivators. They were only a thin layer away from the void. Therefore, as soon as they were released, they immediately took part. Not only was it a fashion trend, but it was also the only thing they could do to help the 5-ring home planet. Originally, Yan Qing had thought that if there were still no participants, she would simply open it to Foundation establishment cultivators. However, there was no need for that now. With hundreds and thousands of Jin Dan cultivators joining, her subject immediately became extremely crowded. She had no choice but to restrict the conditions for joining. For example, one's own strength must be acceptable, and it must not affect one's own cultivation progress, etc. The huge database of data was limited to these Jin Dan cultivators. That was all the airspace the 5-ring had passed through in the past 20,000 years. What was the cause of the deviation in the direction of the airspace? Why did it attract those small celestial bodies? How many accidental collisions were there? What were the main factors behind this? If these things were seen by Supremes of Yuanying, they would not have any feelings at all. This was because they had long lost interest in the vastness of the void. The first few excursions were exciting enough, but after going out hundreds and thousands of times, it was like facing an old couple who had been mortal for decades. How could there be any passion left? However, the Jin Dan cultivators were different, because they had never gone out before. In front of them was a new world. It was completely unfamiliar, full of fantasies, and made people yearn for it. Even if most of them could not reach the level of Yuanying, if they could use this opportunity to understand part of the truth of the universe, it would not be a waste of their lives. Their views were incomparably childish. Their principles were unclear, their concepts were confusing, and they were full of mistake. Listening to their discussions was completely like listening to a group of primary school students discussing calculus. However, they had one advantage, and that was their unconstrained and unconstrained thinking. They were strange and eccentric, and they were not bound by fixed views. They spread erroneous rumors that made people spit out rice, and they became a mess of chatter. The high-level cultivators simply could not tolerate it, and they did not have the time to correct their misconceptions. This was because many things could be naturally understood as long as one entered the void of the universe. However, they could not be explained through the atmosphere. Therefore, the high-level cultivators basically disappeared, except for Yendai, who took out 2 hours every time to discuss with them. However, this did not affect the enthusiasm of the Jin Dan cultivators. After holding back for so many years, they finally found a window to come into contact with the universe. Even if they were enjoying themselves, they were overjoyed. The 3 great discussions every month had never been interrupted. They even wrote a general outline of the orbit of the 5 rings. This was the essence of what they believed to be infallible. In any case, they had already submitted it. Whether or not it could be of help to the 5 rings, and whether or not the seniors of the high-level cultivators would pay attention to it was another matter. On this day, the Jin Dan Universe Discussion Conference was completely silent. However, the silent atmosphere could not suppress the enthusiasm in their hearts. Their fanatical gazes made it so that they did not mind revealing their inner thoughts at all. This was because the conference this time was attended by the god in their hearts, Lu Hongxian. 80 years had already passed, and everything was still the same, peaceful as usual. Yen Dai had some matters to attend to, so she left a strange letter and asked Lu Xiaoyi to help her take care of this academic organization that had already become a paradise for Jin Dan cultivators. In the eyes of the high-level cultivators, it was just a joke. No one else was willing to come, so she could only look for Lu Xiaoyi. She was one of the few people on the dome who dared to make such an unreasonable request to Lu Hongxian. Lu Xiaoyi did not mind. In fact, he did not dislike this kind of conference. It was never too early to cultivate one's interest. It was normal to start when one was in the foundation establishment stage. According to his theory, even mortals should have some basic knowledge of the universe, let alone cultivators, who were at the top of human wisdom. After all, this was just a learning session. There were no constructive suggestions. He was willing to teach, but he did not want to spend time on 1 + 1 = 2. In any case, one should have some foundation, right? This was the reason why he appeared here. He had caught up, so he came. The universe belongs to everyone. It does not depend on whether you can truly enter it or not. As long as your heart is here, the universe will also reveal the truth to you. The key is imagination. This is the source of all power, the driving force to decipher the mysteries of the universe. You may not have practical experience, but you are not inferior to anyone in terms of imagination. I personally support this conference organized by Senior Sister Yen Dai. Of course, some stubborn fellows do not think so. What you need to do is to teach them how to slap their faces. The Jin Dan cultivators cheered loudly. Lu Hongxian was indeed different. He pointed out the crux of the matter with one sentence. That's right, it was to teach them how to slap those stubborn old fellows in the face, even if they were elders. This was Xuanyuan's tradition. Chapter 2308. Lu Xiaoyi only used one sentence to ignite the competitive spirit of the Jin Dan. As a result, he was drowned in all kinds of weird nonsense. Lack of basic common sense, lack of basic understanding of the universe, a gap in the realm of Tao, a huge gap in understanding. If all these were combined with their fanaticism, Lu Xiaoyi found himself in the middle of a lunatic's ravings. He felt a little regretful. Had he gone overboard with his words of encouragement? While these guys were encouraging, it seemed like they should be put in a chokehold. Otherwise, they would not have said that the final destination of the 5 rings would be the center of the universe, the land of the yellow dragon. Did they really think that the 5 rings were the only ones in the universe? This confidence was good, but it was a bit too self-righteous. He reaped what he sowed, so other than smiling and encouraging gazes, he could not pour cold water on them. There were too many novel sayings, and almost everyone had their own set of sayings. Most of them were just noise, but he still had to pretend that he was listening attentively. It was hard work. Occasionally, there would be a few who could point out the main points, but these so-called main points had long been within the many judgments of the major cultivators. The so-called flash of inspiration of the Jindan stage cultivators could not escape the careful thinking of the high-level cultivators. This was the truth. Their potential was in the future and not in the present. They could think of refreshing ideas that could solve problems. If that was the case, what was the point of cultivation? Let's see who could fantasize more. Lu Xiaoyi thought so. The most important thing was that they could not lose their motivation to continue fantasizing. This was the true essence of teaching. After 4 hours, the discussion slowly came to an end. The Golden Core cultivators were aware that most of their discussions were nonsense. However, they were grateful that Lu Kuxian continued to listen to them and chatted with them non-stop. The 100 or so Jindan all had their own suggestions, except for one who remained silent. Lu Xiaoyi's principle of doing things was to leave out a group, and not leave out a single one. No matter what the reason was, he had to be given a chance. Young friend, I see that you've been thinking hard. Could it be that you've thought of a key point to save the world? Why don't you tell us? No one here will laugh at you. This was a newly minted Jindan. He was a little inexperienced, so he was very restrained. He had sneaked in through unorthodox means and did not have the qualifications to enter the seminar. Therefore, he did not dare to speak casually for fear of being chased out. In fact, he was already very satisfied to be able to participate in this and coincidentally see Lu Chuanqi at such a close distance. He didn't care whether he could speak or not, but since Lu Chuanqi asked, he had to answer. Lu Zhu, it may not be my turn to save the world. My current ability is probably only enough to save our village. Everyone laughed. This was a very sensible newcomer. Just a self-deprecating remark was enough to gain everyone's approval. This was actually an extraordinary ability, a potential for great things. In my opinion, we have studied the countless possibilities of the trajectories of the 5 ring continents, including our whimsical imagination and the rational analysis of our seniors. With so many people brainstorming together, it is unlikely that we have missed anything. Then, could it be that there is some special reason that does not follow the normal laws of the celestial bodies? Everyone laughed. It was yet another so-called special mysterious reason. There were already too many similar theories among them, but their so-called mysteries were actually worthless in the eyes of advanced cultivators. It was because their horizons were not broad enough that they were narrow-minded. When they reached Yuanying, they would know that some of these mysteries were simply normal cosmic phenomena, while some were actually variations of certain cultivation phenomena. It was not surprising. The Tao realm would strip away the veil covering most of the so-called mysteries. Just like a beautiful girl walking on the road, the wind would blow away her veil. Upon closer inspection, it turned out that it was the second daughter of the Wang family next door who was causing trouble. However, Lu Xiaoyi still gave him an encouraging look. He had already heard too many mysteries today, so it didn't matter if he heard one more. At least, this was a chance for this young Jindan to prove himself, and not some nonsense he was spouting. The young Jindan opened his mouth, and then spoke frankly with assurance. We don't know much about mysteries at this realm. Most of them are just wishful guesses and imaginations, but there are occasionally some that are reliable. A few days ago, I went to the young geocentric realm with a few Yuanying martial uncles. Only then did I have a specific understanding of the composition and source of the 5th ring's spiritual opportunity. I heard from the martial uncles that the young geocentric realm and the 5th ring are actually not a whole. Instead, it was formed after a long period of time in the universe. The 5th ring originally did not have such abundant spiritual opportunity. If there was no young geocentric realm, it would at most be an ordinary spiritual opportunity star field. It was precisely because it merged with the young geocentric realm that it became the most famous top-notch spiritual opportunity star field in the universe. Is there a problem with my understanding? Seeing that everyone was silent, the young Jean Dan licked his lips. I was thinking, before the fifth ring became the current fifth ring, what was it like in the ancient times? This young geocentric realm, where did the heart of the spirit vein that is filled with endless spiritual opportunity come from? Was it formed naturally? Or was it separated after birth? Was it a core separated from some astronomical phenomenon that we still don't know about? Black hole? White hole? Gray hole? If that's the case, the fusion of the young geocentric realm and the fifth ring may drift forever, constantly changing its trajectory with the gravitational force of various stars in the universe. Perhaps for tens of millions of years, perhaps for hundreds of millions of years, there is no goal, and there is no fixed trajectory. However, a new era is about to begin. I heard from the Uncle Masters that many astronomical phenomena are undergoing inexplicable changes. Could this inexplicable change be just because we still lack understanding of the universe? In fact, their changes are still regular, following the most profound fundamental principles of the universe? Then, is the fifth ring also undergoing changes? Imperceptible influence? Something we didn't notice? For example, the young geocentric realm drifted from the ancient times until now, and finally, because of the arrival of the new era, it wants to go home, towards the whole that nurtured it, no matter what whole it is or what great astronomical phenomenon it is moving towards. If all of these inferences are true, the real danger of the fifth ring may not be a collision. It is a huge energy field in the void. I don't know what will happen when the fifth ring really returns home with the young geocentric realm. Will the fifth ring be devoured? Will the atmosphere disappear? Will the human race go extinct? Will it be the end of the world? Or will it just go home and take a look? Will it continue drifting forever? Everyone is saying that the fifth ring's flight path may be dangerous. Is this a type of threat? No one spoke, because this Jean Dan's inference was the most reliable delusion so far, and it was partly true. Everyone looked towards Lu Hongxian. Lu Xiaoyi smiled brightly. What's your name? I don't know if what you said will happen or not. But just based on your words, it's worth me going out to verify it. Chapter 2309. Lu Xiaoyi wasn't just encouraging him. He was really amazed by this idea. This was a very novel angle, and the key was that it was possible. Regarding the fifth ring, regarding the changes in the universe, regarding the origin of the fifth ring, it had its own unique points. It was hard to imagine that this idea came from Jean Dan's mouth. With this starting point, a few large-scale celestial phenomena that would appear in the future of the fifth ring appeared in his mind, including a white hole. Your name? Jean Dan was a little excited and actually forgot to answer Lu Zu's question. My surname is Go, and my name is Lanzi. Lu Xiaoyi patted his shoulder. Go Lanzi? Good name. You have the potential to destroy the heavens. I think highly of you. As soon as the seminar ended, Lu Xiaoyi didn't say anything else and directly rose into the air. His figure flashed, and he appeared in the void. The next moment, he turned into a stream of light and disappeared in the blink of an eye. After more than 80 years of searching without slacking off, he knew the celestial phenomena around the future of the fifth ring. If he didn't consider the collision of celestial bodies and only considered large-scale energy field celestial phenomena, there weren't many final choices. After all, it had to be big enough to break down a huge object like the fifth ring's domain. This wasn't something that a small energy field could do. Not to mention the distance, just within a year's distance, there were 3 such energy fields. One was the Siphon Nebula, one was an abstract energy field, and the other was a white hole. Lu Xiaoyi located these 3 abnormal celestial phenomena in his mind one by one. What made his heart palpitate was that the fifth ring's domain hadn't accelerated or deviated. On one hand, this was because the fifth ring was too big, but on the other hand, it could also be understood as the fifth ring's unwavering trajectory. He hoped it was the former, but he was afraid it was the latter. The three celestial phenomena were about the same distance from the fifth ring. He didn't search for them one by one. Time was tight, so he could only go to the one he thought was most likely. Actually, he had been to all three celestial phenomena before, but unfortunately, as a dignified half-immortal, he couldn't think as deeply as Jean Dan. The heavens took pity on him, and the heavens treated him well. Golanzi had given him a hint. If it had been a few months or half a year later, it would have been too late. Once a fifth ring soul master was pulled into the gravitational field of this energy body, the consequences would be unimaginable. It wasn't as if the great cultivators hadn't considered the effects of these three celestial phenomena on the passing fifth ring. He had also made a strict estimation. In the 20,000 years of wandering history of the fifth ring, he had passed through many such gravitational fields, but he had been fine. Because he couldn't pull it. There were many harsh conditions that needed to be met in order to have a fatal attraction to each other. It was not as simple as trying to pull in every male on the street. It depends on your size, appearance, temperament, wealth, age, length. Of course, size was the most important factor. Ordinary gravitational fields were powerless against a massive object like the fifth ring. At most, they could only slightly change its trajectory. Then, the fifth ring would use its enormous inertia to break through the pull of any gravitational field and fly away. This was the case for these three celestial phenomena. After a full field investigation, the great cultivators believed that they did not have such a strong gravitational force at all. They were not even as strong as the gravitational fields of the fifth ring in the 20,000 years of wandering history. That was why they were classified as harmless. But if the fifth ring's young domain was really like this, it was no longer a matter of pure gravitational force, but a matter of the same origin. What Lu Xiaoyi wanted to solve was which celestial phenomenon was of the same origin as the young domain. If it was confirmed, then this should be where the real threat was. This meant that the operation of the fifth ring was not random and aimless. Instead, when the heavenly axiom decided to start a new era, the great Tao began to collapse. At least 20,000 years before Li Wuya brought Tao De down to the lower realm, the fifth ring had already begun to set foot on the road to return home. A little idealistic? It was reasonable for human beings to want to return home when faced with a change, because living beings always had their own feelings and sentiments for their home. Then, did the astral realms have such sentiments too? It shouldn't. Therefore, he still needed to find a deeper reason. For the time being, he was not in a hurry to inform his friends and the higher-ups of the fifth ring. He had already cried wolf once. Before everything was concluded, he did not want to cry wolf a second time. His target, the white hole, was also the place he suspected the most intuitively. When he rode the escape light and sprinted with all his strength, his speed was close to exceeding the limits of human beings. Wherever his escape light passed, space began to distort. This was a kind of escape between the main world and the dimensional space. The principle was to cut space into 4 or 5 dimensions. In such a dimension, the shortest straight line between 2 points in the 3-dimensional space was not the shortest, but there was another curved shortcut. He could only do 4 or 5 dimensions now. When he took another step, he could do 6 or 7 dimensions or even more. At that time, when he started to escape, his real body in the main world would be almost impossible to see in the main world. It would be another realm. Speed, at his realm, was no longer just about speed. Between 2 points, I can find a line shorter than yours. If one reached the realm of immortals, gold immortals and Daluo golden immortals could appear in any universe with a raise of their feet. It was just that they did not know whether it was a 100-dimensional or a 1,000-dimensional surface. They could already condense the distance between any 2 points in the universe to the distance of 1 step on a certain surface. That was the limit of vertical escape. At this speed, it took less than a month for him to arrive at the white hole that the fifth ring cultivators called Vitiligo 6. The reason why it was called 6 was because the fifth ring had encountered the sixth white hole in 20,000 years. Vitiligo 6 was still as usual, quietly hovering in the void of the universe. From afar, it was huge, like a huge, colorful mushroom slowly rotating there. Countless magnetic field rays, large and small objects were thrown out by it. It was not a gluttonous snake, but a bubble fish. Based on basic common sense, Lu Xiaoyi did not go deep when he passed by it before. He thought that there was no need to waste time here. However, this time, he decided to go deep. In the void of the universe, the big holes in the universe had always been a taboo for cultivators. It was one of the few celestial phenomena that could not be completely explained by cultivation theory. No one knew what would happen if they were pulled into it. Anyway, very few people had tried it. Even if there were really brave people who did not fear death, it was basically a one-way trip. Therefore, when traveling in the universe, cultivators would try to avoid it as much as possible, to prevent accidents from happening. Lu Xiaoyi was the same. In his 3,000 years of cultivation, in theory, he had encountered such celestial phenomena. For example, the inner and outer scenic sky, the no-worries road, and the road of no return. However, those so-called holes were at the end of the hole. They were places that had been modified by great powers. He had never entered an active hole. However, this time, he could not stop at just a little. Chapter 23:10. In the land of the Yellow Dragon, thousands of cultivators gathered. In fact, thousands of cultivators could no longer accurately describe the actual number of cultivators here. There was already more than 10,000, so there was no need to count. After Qing Xian left the fifth ring, the first thing he did was to rush to the land of the Yellow Dragon through the interior sky. However, this was not something that could be done in one go. The land of the Yellow Dragon could not be directly projected there. He could only project it to the periphery of the land of the Yellow Dragon. In 20 years, there was no warning from Lu Xiaoyi. This made him feel relieved. There should be no problem, right? More than 80 years had passed. Did he really think that it was a legend? That changes always happened at the last moment of 100 years? He relaxed and arrived at the land of the Yellow Dragon. The scene in front of him made him, a half-immortal who had already experienced countless big scenes, excited. This was the land of the Yellow Dragon, and right above it was the celestial court. Of course, it was hidden in countless auspicious clouds, making it unreachable. At first, he thought that these auspicious clouds were naturally gathered because of the existence of the celestial court. Later, he found out from Lu Xiaoyi that these things were actually created by people who flattered him. Whitewashing, faking, and exaggerating were everywhere. If the celestial court was like this, how could there be anything else? Therefore, the power and packaging that the old guys in his family talked about were not completely unreasonable. Having an old man in the family was like having a treasure. He could see more clearly than the young people. Under the auspicious clouds, the space was extremely vast. It was the size of dozens of ordinary universes. It was enough to accommodate no matter how many cultivators gathered. However, if one wanted to set up a monument, it could only be at the most central part of the universe. A three-dimensional universe space with a round top and a round bottom. Was this what it meant? Cultivators could not directly enter this circular universe space. If they wanted to enter, they had to do two things. First, they had to propose the meaning of the Great Tao to the circular universe. After approval, they could enter and set up a monument. Second, they had to go in and look at other people's Great Tao monument. As long as they penetrated their spiritual power into the monument, they would turn into a rainbow and enter the monument. However, they would not stop outside the circular world. Under such rules, there were tens of thousands of cultivators gathered outside the circular world. However, inside the circular world, there were only 1,000 or so Tao tablets standing alone. However, how many people were inside the Tao tablets was another matter. He had been ordered by the three clear orthodoxies of the universe to erect the tombstone, and there was a time limit. Of course, the time limit was not too strict, and he was still given the opportunity to observe the other tombstones. He only needed to erect his heavenly tribulation great Tao tombstone within 10 years. Before that, of course, he had to take a good look at the specific situation in the surrounding world. The 1,000 Tao tablets still had the 36 innate Taos as the main ones. For example, there were dozens of 5 elements Taos and quite a number of yin-yang Taos. None of the 36 Taos were left out. This was the conservative way of thinking. With the mature Taos as the foundation, and with the changes in the universe, the Taos became the 5 elements, yin-yang and innate Taos. When the epoch changed, these great Taos of the same origin would compare with each other and finally decide on the 5 elements, yin, yang, and so on that were most suitable for the new epoch. This was the Conservative Party, or it could also be called the Natural Party. The rest were the Reformists and Radicals. There were relatively few of them now because most of them were in a wait-and-see state. However, as the new epoch approached, those strange great Taos were bound to spring up like bamboo shoots. It was just that it was not obvious yet. Even now there were a few new great Taos. The more famous ones were Pure Yang, Blood River, Netherworld, Life, and so on. Here, Qing Xian did not see Shi Shi and Yan Chang. Presumably, with their impatient tempers, it was impossible for them to have been watching others erect Taos for so many years. They definitely could not hold back and wanted to do it themselves. Shi must have erected the great Tao of life. There were 2 Tao tablets of life in the circular world, and one of them must belong to Shi. Outside, he could not distinguish it for the time being. He needed to go in and explore to understand. Yan Chang's great Tao was reincarnation. There were many of them. Qing Xian counted carefully and found that there were 8 or 9 of them. It was troublesome to find them, but he had to find them. At least, he had to know where his friends were. He had to find Shi first because it was easier. He had to choose one of the 2. If he was lucky, he would only need to do it once. After finding Shi, it was very easy to find Yan Chang. The 2 of them should know each other. Qing Xian did not hesitate. He had limited time. He concentrated his spirit on one of the Tao tablets of life and his body immediately disappeared. He went in a bit early because after he left, the other half-immortals beside him faintly transmitted their word. One of the half-immortals laughed and said, "Senior Marshal Brothers, you came? Senior Marshal Brothers, we found out after entering and exiting the Tao tablets that the Tao tablets of this circular world can isolate all external information. Therefore, if you Senior Marshal Brothers have any warning objects, it is best to leave it on one of the Senior Marshal Brothers outside. Otherwise, once you go in, you won't be able to receive anything." White hole, it was a jet source in the universe. It could provide matter and energy to the external region. However, it could not absorb any matter and radiation from the external region. Therefore, white hole was a special cosmic celestial body that only emitted and did not absorb. It was the exact opposite of a black hole. It was a strong gravitational source. Its external gravitational properties were the same as a black hole. White hole could absorb the surrounding matter to form a matter layer. It was precisely because it only emitted and did not absorb that the vigilance of cultivators towards white hole was very limited. Lu Xiaoyi began to approach this white hole. What made him feel a little relieved was that compared to the most famous black hole in the universe, this white hole was just a little brother. Its volume had not reached the point where it could frighten people. With his current ability as a half-immortal, entering it was not a problem. The only problem was how deep he could go. How deep? It depended on whether he could get rid of the gravitational field of the white hole. The closer he got and the deeper he went, the stronger the gravitational force would be. When it was so strong that he almost could not control his strength and would be firmly sucked into the boundary layer, it should be the time for him to leave. From afar, the white hole did not seem big. When he got closer and closer, the big rotating mushroom plate came pressing down on him. He was like an ant crawling in a boundless desert. At this moment, humans seemed so small. But he knew he had come to the right place. When he really entered the periphery of the white hole and did not look at it from afar, the warning in his heart became more and more obvious. It was not his fault that he swallowed everything in his previous patrol. It was impossible for him to enter the celestial state one by one. It was not enough even after many years. He could only pass by from afar, judge, consider, and then leave after he had explored a few places. This should be it, right? Although he had not completely figured out the ins and outs, he quickly warned his friends, including Shishi's funny 5 hairs talisman. He did not deliberately warn the 5th ring. It was not time yet. When his friends arrived, they would have enough time to inform the 5th ring. Don't eat alone. He did not forget Qing Xian's advice. Chapter 23:11. After sending the message, Lu Xiaoyi felt that he was prepared. He believed that his friends were better than the group of 5th ring cultivators. After all, there was a difference in realms. Some things could not be solved with more people. For example, this white hole, could it be filled with more people? He controlled his speed and cut towards the center of the huge mushroom cloud. Only at the center could he better understand the inner workings of the white hole and understand the danger it posed to the 5th ring cultivators. How could it threaten the 5th ring cultivators? This was the natural desire for knowledge as a cultivator. He had to understand the mechanism before he could find a solution. After all, this thing was not a physical planet. He could not achieve his goal by destroying it violently. The mushroom cloud was too big, hundreds of millions of miles. As he slowly approached the center of the mushroom cloud, he could clearly feel the strong gravitational force on his body. However, he could completely withstand it. Although he was still an ant, he was still a relatively strong ant in the origin world. There were some vague feelings, but they were still uncertain. Therefore, he began to walk deeper into the mushroom, plunging into the mushroom core. Only by digging deeper would he be able to see more of what was going on. When he really went in, he could clearly feel a faint power. It was not in the strength of the gravitational force, but a change close to the essence. This white hole was mutating. But what was the direction of mutation? He could choose to leave and look for people, but the problem was that even if he found people, he still could not solve the problem of the white hole's transformation. To put it bluntly, even if he found people, he still had to go in to find the answer because his realm was the highest and he was the strongest. There was also the problem of time. If he went back and forth to look for people, a few months would pass. He still did not know what changes would happen to the white hole. The distance between the 5th ring and the white hole was less than a year. He was not willing to waste precious time on the journey back and forth. 3,000 years of cultivation had given him incomparable confidence. Even if he did not need others to package him, he would still be the savior. Not only the 5th ring cultivator, but also the universe. Therefore, he continued to go deeper and deeper. As he went deeper, he obtained more and more information. Fortunately, he now had more than half of the Xiantian Dao and had a deep understanding of the Xiantian 5 manifestations. In the process, he finally understood what kind of disaster the 5th ring cultivators would encounter. In this cultivation world, there were many proven theories about the universe, including the 4 holes of the universe. One of the most important points was that a white hole was actually the inverse of a black hole. There was a 3-dimensional channel between a black hole and a white hole. One could enter from the black hole and exit from the white hole. The passageway that connected them was a wormhole. The road of no return was a half-abandoned wormhole. These 3 holes were like a sewer connected to the mouth and the door, forming the most famous spectacle in the universe. However, there was another important theory, which was that black holes and white holes could be interchanged under certain circumstances. In other words, if a person were to stand upside down, the rigid door would become the mouth, and the mouth would become the rigid door? The key wasn't the reversal of the door and the mouth, but the fact that when the 5th ring passed through here, they originally thought that they were passing through a safe door that could only pull but not swallow, but in the end, it suddenly became a mouth that could only swallow and not pull. This was going to kill him. At present, he still couldn't determine whether the 5th ring's young realm was spat out from here in ancient or immemorial times. It was no longer important. What was important was that the will of the universe decided to spit it out back then and how it wanted to swallow it now. The young realm came from here, and this place changed into a black hole. This was the misfortune of the 5th ring. After figuring out the process, the next step was how to avoid it. Although the white hole didn't look much different from normal on the surface, the conversion between a black hole and a white hole wasn't an extremely slow process like ordinary astronomical phenomena. It could easily take millions of years. The black and white holes couldn't change even a little bit. They didn't have such a mechanism. Because the flow of matter was always flowing in and out, the roll change between them might be very short. Even if it wasn't an instant, it would be compressed into a few days or even a day, or even shorter. After a long time, the wormhole wouldn't be able to hold on and collapse, and the black hole and white hole would have no foundation to exist. It was precisely because he wasn't sure when the rolls of the black hole and white hole would change that he couldn't easily leave here. Only by staying here could he have a chance to prevent such a roll change. Lu Xiaoyi quickly understood his current situation. Changing the trajectory of the 5th ring? Impossible. The trajectory of the 5th ring could only be adjusted slightly. It was meaningless to adjust it now. Notifying the cultivators of the 5th ring? It was also meaningless. No matter how many people came, only one could come in and change the conversion process through the Tao state. This wasn't a matter of working together. It could only be him. So it was meaningless to notify them or not. Should he evacuate the 5th ring's population? That was even more impossible. Tens of billions of people were not tens of billions of insects that could fly. Even if he used all the floating rafts that could be used in the 5th ring, how many people could he carry at one time? Tens of thousands? Hundreds of thousands? A cup of water on a burning cart of firewood, it would only add to the chaos. The only people who might be able to help him in the Tao state were a few half-immortal friends. Shi and Yancheng were still not enough. Only Qing Xian might be able to play a few tricks? After preparing for nearly 100 years and searching for nearly 100 years, in the end, he still ended up in a situation where he was fighting alone. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. But no matter what, he still had to thank Senbai. How did this guy know that the 5th ring would face such a tribulation? He must have obtained it when he was in the immortal court. Otherwise, no one would have such a view and vision of the universe. After thinking clearly about the gains and losses, he no longer hesitated. The only thing left was to solve the problem of the conversion between the black hole and the white hole. If he succeeded, he would forget about everything. If he failed, he would forget about everything. He didn't feel that the burden of tens of billions of people was too heavy. He had tried his best. It was just life and death. After going around and around, he still had to return to the Tao state. What kind of Tao state was most suitable for this kind of environment? If it was only about the 36 innate Tao, then it must be the essence of the universe, the 5 grand Tao state. But in the changes of the universe and the impatience before the change of era, the ancient 5 grand Tao state might not be able to keep up with the situation. If the 5 grand Tao was still in charge, Such a strange conversion between the black hole and the white hole was unlikely to succeed. So, he still decided to use his newly researched devour. Black hole, wasn't it devouring? After understanding all this, in the depths of the white hole's mushroom cloud, he spread out the devour Tao state and looked for a point of convergence with the white hole's operation. He was deeply immersed in the three subversive great Taos of the future new era. He didn't let any of them go. It was to ensure that nothing would go wrong at the crucial moment. Now, it was time to test the quality of his devour Tao. Chapter 23:12. P.S. Sir D. Duo's new book, Reboot 99. Everyone is welcome to enjoy, vote, and collect it. At the Dome, the Jean Dan happily dispersed. They saw Lu Zhu in outer space. Obviously, he really went to outer space to find the possible home of the young realm? With this judgment, everyone was more envious of Golanzi. It was hard for Lu Zhu not to be successful. One after another, they came over to congratulate him. Even if they were sword cultivators, they still understood the ways of the world. Although they were reckless, they still needed to be a little cunning. Didn't you see the temperament of Ancestor Li in the past and Ancestor Lu now? They were not just practicing swordsmanship. Therefore, a golden core cultivator asked, "What do you think? If Lu Zhu really discovered something, wouldn't the Fifth Ring Navigation Route Association have made a great contribution? But what I'm worried about is that Lu Zhu went alone. Will he be in any danger?" Another Jean Dan nodded. "That's right. If it's a spiritual cultivator, needless to say, Lu Zhu can even kill immortals. What can threaten him? But now his opponent is a heavenly phenomenon cultivator. I think we shouldn't just ignore it. We can't go out. Why don't we inform the martial uncles and let them decide what to do?" These Jean Dan swordsmen were all quick-witted and meticulous. They were the backbone of the lower middle class of the Dome. No one was stupid. They were calm and cautious. Therefore, 100 people found a Yuanying martial uncle with a high position and told him the truth. This Yuanying didn't dare to be negligent. In the Dome, everything about Lu Zhu was not to be taken lightly. He knew the truth of the Dome. He didn't look for anyone else. He directly found one of the perfected cultivators closest to Lu Zhu, Song Rong. When Song Rong heard this, even though this matter was still inconclusive, but this theory and Lu Shi's temper, as his closest disciple, he had followed him from Zhou Xian to this place and had long treated him as a teacher. He knew a little about Lu Shi's true intentions for staying in the Fifth Ring. Therefore, the group of true sovereigns who were closest to Lu Xiaoyi also knew about this matter, and the news spread quickly. They did not believe in Golanzi's fantasies. But if even Lu Zhu was willing to personally make a trip for this, it meant that there must be something they did not understand. But the question was, with several such celestial phenomena, where would Lu Zhu go? Guandu opened the star map and said resolutely, "It's too far. Don't worry about it. The emphasis should be placed on the nearby ones." Now it seemed that there were only 3 suspicious celestial phenomena: the Siphon Nebula, the abstract force field, and the white hole. I knew that Little wanted to get to the bottom of things first, but some things are always wrong, and the timing may not be perfect. This is related to the Fifth Ring, so we can't be too careful. As for why Little E is staying here, even if he doesn't say it, we can guess. Then let's send out all the monarchs, split into 3 groups, and go to 3 different places to see where Little E is. Also, inform the 3 pure ones and the supreme ones that we can't hide this kind of thing. We can't blindly care about our own face. For the safety of the Fifth Ring, what's wrong with being slapped in the face again? This time, it's my decision to move out. I'm not afraid of being slapped in the face. The Dome swordsman monarchs rose into the sky. They were also very clear that Yuanying was very limited in dealing with celestial phenomena, and it was not good to make a big fuss about it. Lu Shi's speed was too fast, and they could not even do half of it, let alone yuanying. The three groups split into 3 arrowheads, breaking through the sky at full speed. They were also very curious as to why Lu Shi was so persistent about the 5th ring. Was something really going to happen? No one knew, but no matter who it was, as long as they thought about the nearly 10 billion people on the 5th ring, a kind of fear would arise spontaneously. Lu Xiaoyi activated the devouring Tao state, allowing himself to fully match the changes in the rhythm of the white hole. Of course, there was also the faint black hole at the other end of the wormhole. He could feel that the changes in the rhythm of the black hole and the white hole were becoming more and more consistent, and the resonance caused by the wormhole was becoming more and more obvious. This meant that when the resonance reached a certain level, the black hole and the white hole would continue to swap roles. The one that appeared near the 5th ring was a black hole with its mouth wide open, and the 5th ring was flying there without hesitation. But at this time, he felt that his Tao state was a little unable to keep up with the frequency of the resonance. It was not that his Tao state was not enough, but that he was too far away from the black hole. If he wanted to change this situation, he could not only use his Tao state at the mushroom cloud of the white hole, but also go to the wormhole and think of a solution between the black hole and the white hole. In other words, he had to enter the interior of an active white hole or black hole. How long had the last person who did this been dead for? However, the last person who did this was also not in the midst of the changes in the epoch. Lu Xiaoyi did not think that he would definitely die if he went in. It was not because of how strong he was, but because of the changes in the universe brought about by the change in the epoch. What was stable would become chaotic, and what was safe would become dangerous. Then what would become of the 9 deaths and 1 life? Would it become 9 deaths and 1 death? The universe was like this, always giving you difficult problems. Should you face them bravely or avoid them? He did not seem to have a choice. It was all disguised as a saint. Lu Xiaoyi spat and plunged deeper without hesitation. Once again, he had forced himself into a desperate situation. He could not remember how many times it had been. He seemed to have gotten used to it a long time ago. Every time he was in a desperate situation, his thoughts would always be exceptionally sharp, and his inspiration would no longer appear suddenly. Instead, it would flash non-stop. He was like gunpowder, and only in an explosion would he show his greatest power. What the hell is going on? Isn't it just changing the immortal court? Do they have to make things so difficult for me? And even bring along my own realm? Lu Xiaoyi complained as he plunged deeper. He completely penetrated the mushroom cloud of the white hole and followed a pipe forward. He could not go back now. As for the direction? Actually, it was very easy to determine. He just needed to follow the direction of the aura coming from the black hole. Just like crawling in the intestines, the direction of the stench would definitely be the door, and the direction of the garlic would definitely be the mouth. It would never be wrong. His 6 senses had been completely sealed. In the winding wormhole, the surging energy from the direction of the black hole constantly washed over his body, like a jet shot out from a particle accelerator. Realizing that death was approaching, his inspiration began to shine again. Thus, he had the most ridiculous response in history. He opened his mouth, released his sphincter, and turned himself into the trinity of the black hole, wormhole, and white hole. This kind of energy transformation was unbearable, but he had to do it. If he did not do so, he would instantly die in the energy wash. He was only a half-immortal, not an immortal. If he had to transform his body, then he would change it into the trinity of the black hole. It just so happened that he realized the weakness of his body when he clashed head-on with the immortal rock. He might as well take this opportunity. This kind of body refinement was extremely tragic. Chapter 23:13. P.S. Sir D. Duo's new book, Reboot 99. Everyone is welcome to enjoy, vote, and collect it. The cultivators of the fifth ring were on the move again. But this time, the cultivators were mainly monarchs. What affected their decision was not only because Lu Qing had rushed over, but also because of Go Lanzi's strange remarks. Go Lanzi's strange ideas were more complicated the lower one's realm was, and the higher one's realm was, the more profound it was. So when Lu Xiaoyi heard it, he immediately took off. Guandu immediately made the decision, and Qing Yangzi and Chang Jin followed him. They all knew the fifth ring very well, and they knew that the biggest weakness of the fifth ring was actually one: the young realm, because the young realm and the fifth ring were not a complete whole, and because the young realm was indispensable to the fifth ring. They knew that there had been man-made disasters in the history of the fifth ring, and the serious people's counterattack was through the young realm. But their thinking made them only think of the problem of the young realm as an internal problem, and no one had ever thought of connecting it with the natural phenomena of the outside world. Now that someone thought so, it was not unreasonable. It was a very real and fatal threat. If all of this was true, no one could sleep well before they found the natural phenomenon that attracted the young realm. So they could understand, and so they did not dare to be negligent. In the cultivation world, it was not only the ability of a half-immortal to make a prompt decision, but the cultivators below had limited information and cognition, which affected their judgment. But once they had doubts, they would also act swiftly and decisively. Their flight was much slower than Lu Xiaoyi's. Because they weren't going to fight, there was no need for them to maintain a formation. Once everyone was in the air, it didn't take long for them to fly up and down. The stronger ones were far in the lead, while the weaker ones were cursing from behind. They were all gathering their strength for the same purpose. Light and Zofan were the first to arrive at the White Hole, but it still took them nearly 2 months. Not far from the White Hole, a lonely broken sword head made them understand everything. It was here, and Lu Qing had already entered. The biggest characteristic of Lu Xiaoyi's way of doing things was that he was meticulous in his thinking. What he hated the most was to leave behind countless loopholes to create coincidences, just like in legends. Even so, he would often push himself to the limit. If he were to be like those brainless protagonists, he would not even be able to get out of the lower 3 stars and would have to be buried in Pooh City. Therefore, even though he seemed to be impulsive in his investigation, he had actually made sufficient preparations. He had warned his friends before he was certain, such as leaving a broken sword outside the White Hole. With a sweep of their spiritual senses, the two of them understood Lu Shi's meaning. Guang Ming said solemnly, "Master Lu won't let us in." It was useless. But outside matters require our full authority to deal with. In that case, we still need to discuss whether we should go in or not, but the most important thing now is to gather everyone here. It seems that there is no need to investigate the other 2 heavenly phenomena in detail. In addition, establishing communication with the fifth ring is also very important. Zofan nodded. Exactly. The characteristic of swordsmen was that they paid attention to efficiency. The 2 of them and the domed swordsman who arrived later immediately divided up the work. Some closely monitored the changes in the White Hole, while others went to the other 2 areas to gather people. A month later, a large group of Fifth Ring Supremes gathered outside the White Hole. The person had indeed disappeared here. But now, everyone was arguing about whether or not they could enter the place. According to Qing Yangzi, Chang Jin, and Guandu's opinion, they should not go in. They should wait for news from Lu Xiaoyi or for Qing Xian and the others to rush back. However, according to Guang Ming, Zofan, and the young Supremes of the 3 Pure Ones, since Master Lu had not sent out any news, there might not be any news after so many months. They should go in. Even if they did not go deep, they should at least investigate within the scope of their abilities. They could not just wait outside like idiots. Radicalism and conservatism exist no matter where they are. In other regions, conservative forces would be relatively stronger, but in the fifth ring it was the exact opposite. Looking at the agitated true monarchs below, Chang Jin blew his beard and glared. Are they rebelling? Qin Yangzi laughed. Very good. Looks like they can't wait for you and me to die of old age. Guan Du said leisurely, dying of old age is better than dying of old age. However, the three of them had great prestige and the fact that they had been in charge of the sex affairs for a long time. Most of the Supremes below them were their direct disciples, so they still had the right to speak. The three old fellows' way of solving problems was still so shrewd and cunning. Qin Yangzi raised his voice and decided, in that case, the minority obeys the majority. We've decided to send 3 people in to investigate. Yes, Guan Du, Chang Jin, and I, the 3 of us old farts, will go in. The others, listen to orders outside, do not act without permission. The Supremes clamored even louder. This was simply using their position to achieve their own goals. Everyone knew that entering a place like a white hole or a black hole would not bode well for them. It might be different for a top half immortal like Master Lu, but for Supremes like them, it was completely different. The 3 old fellows wanted to wade into these muddy waters, but what did they want the youngsters to do? Rising at the sound of a battle had always been the style of the sword vein. However, after 20,000 years of sincere unity, the entire 5th ring had a trace of this temperament. This was especially obvious in the 2 universe wars. The 3 big shots rarely cared about the gains and losses of their orthodoxy in the face of difficulties. Guan Du pulled a long face in the face of the surging voices of doubt below. Shut up, all of you. The 5th ring's tradition is that if there's danger, there will naturally be someone taller to take the risk. Lu Xiaoyi is the tallest, so he went in first. We are the second tallest, so it's naturally our turn next. You don't need to say such nonsense. Whether it's cultivation, vision, experience, or Tao realm, if you brats are better than us, then go in. We won't stop you. If you can't, then stop nagging. This scolding stunned the young Supremes. This was not a battle. What mattered more was one's cultivation, vision, experience, and Tao realm. Therefore, although they were conceited, in front of 3 evergreen trees that had stood tall in the 5th ring for thousands of years, they were still lacking in confidence. It was precisely because of this temperament that the 5th ring Supremes could still stand tall under the pressure of tens of thousands of years. Generation after generation, they never bowed their heads. It could be imagined that even if something really happened to these 3 old fellows, the later generations would still take over their burdens and never shrink back. Chang Jin laughed. The 3 of us, don't walk side by side. We'll walk in single file at a distance so that the person behind can help the person in front in case of an accident. My urine is yellow, I'll go in first. Under the unwilling gazes of the young Supremes, the 3 old fellows began to walk in single file, gradually disappearing into the huge mushroom cloud. The current white hole was very different from when Lu Xiaoyi came 3 months ago. It was still calm before, but now, even from the outside, they could feel that something was happening inside the white hole that they could not understand. Their Tao realm abilities were not enough to make a judgment, but one thing was certain. Unlike Planet Duel, this white hole could really cause harm to the 5th ring Supremes. Chapter 23:14. The 3 old fellows flew in. Chang Jin's urine was the most yellow, Qin Yangzi was the middle yellow, and Guan Du was slightly yellow. If they were fighting with humans, the order would probably be reversed. However, since they were facing a white hole astronomical phenomenon, the Taoist heritage was much better than the sword vein in this aspect. They were indeed very experienced. Even if they were a few levels below Lu Xiaoyi in terms of Tao realm, their long lives compensated them in other aspects, especially the Taoist heritage that covered everything. After going deeper, they came to the same conclusion as Lu Xiaoyi. This white hole was probably going to transform into a black hole. Furthermore, it could happen at any time. Such an outcome meant that the fifth ring was about to encounter something. It was no wonder that Lu Xiaoyi had stayed in the fifth ring. He must have heard some kind of warning, so he had been waiting. Now that it was clear, they realized that they were almost powerless. There was only one way, and that was to stop this transformation. However, the three of them did not have such an ability. It was not something that could be solved with experience. It required a solid Tao realm ability, an ability that could reverse the universe's astronomical phenomenon and change the world. They were unwilling to give up. The three old fellows were anxious and made the same choice as Lu Xiaoyi. They wanted to go deeper and see if they could do anything, even if it was just a little bit, but soon, something that drove them crazy happened. They actually encountered an obstacle and could no longer fly in. Is this the boundary of the white hole's material plane? Why don't I feel like it? Chang Jin shouted. Qin Yangzi also bumped into this plane. No. It's not the boundary. It's the repulsive force inside the white hole. This should be the precursor to the transformation of the black hole. Its internal mechanism is no longer a white hole. We can't go in. It's an unfamiliar Tao realm energy. Guandu also tried a few times. His method was more barbaric. He even used his flying sword to stab, but he also could not pierce in. The power of the white hole astronomical phenomenon was not something a human cultivator could match. Unless you were compatible with it in terms of Tao realm, all other methods would be ineffective. Just as the two old friends despised his barbaric actions, Guandu made a new discovery. That's not right. There's not only the white hole and black hole astronomical phenomenon aura, there seems to be a third type. Chang Jin was shocked and immediately reacted. You mean little E is? Guandu nodded. It should be him. He arrived 3 months earlier than us. At that time, his ability and the white hole were not as unpredictable as it is now. He had the opportunity to go deeper. My judgment is that he's either in the depths of the white hole, or he ran into a wormhole. That reckless fool. Qin Yangzi closed his eyes and pondered. After a long time, he said, "Then, everything is clear now." Little E went deep into it with the intention of using the Tao realm to control the conversion between the white hole and the black hole. We can't help with this. The only thing we can do now is to reach the fifth ring. It's our responsibility to find the best way to minimize the damage before the collision. The three of them silently retreated. When they passed on their findings to the others, the silent atmosphere was oppressive. If it was a false alarm, then there was no need to say anything. They would just burn incense to thank the heavens. However, if something that no one wanted to see happened, they would face the most difficult choice in the history of the fifth ring. Just when everyone couldn't make up their minds and couldn't determine whether the fifth ring would be attracted by the black hole or not, or when the fifth ring could safely pass through and the black hole would change, and other possible factors, a piece of news from the fifth ring completely shattered their fantasies. The Supremes left behind to guard the fifth ring sent them a warning. The fifth ring had started to change direction without warning. The direction of the change was the direction of the white hole. Qin Yangzi waved his hand, his eyes wide open. He no longer had the carefree attitude that had accompanied him for thousands of years. Everyone, the situation is very clear now. Because of the young domain, the fifth ring's trajectory ends at this white hole. I'm almost certain that it will turn into a black hole before it hits. Then, the question now is, what can we do? Every cultivator asked themselves, what could they do? Stop the white hole from changing? This was not within their abilities. Only Lu Xiaoyi had this ability, and he might not succeed. Stop the fifth ring from moving closer to the white hole? This was also not their ability. Even if all the fifth ring cultivators used all their strength, it would be like pouring a cup of water on a burning cart of firewood. Would the cultivators be in danger? Of course not. It would be fine as long as they left the fifth ring. They could also take away almost all the cultivation seeds, including the foundation establishment gene Dan, that could not fly into the void. Therefore, the only ones in danger were the fifth ring domain itself and the close to 10 billion mortals on it. Could they consider the problem this way? In the cultivation world of the universe, protecting mortals was always the first rule. No matter what domain it was, what orthodoxy it was. The fifth ring cultivators could migrate as a whole, but after losing the fifth ring, would they still have the qualifications to call themselves fifth ring cultivators? Would they even have the qualifications to call themselves cultivators? Chang Jin and the other two had already made a decision. In fact, they did not have a second choice. Inform the inner and outer scenic skies that we need the help of half-immortals. Not only us fifth ring cultivators, but also others who don't want to see such a tragedy. We don't need to stay here anymore. Let's go back to the fifth ring. The fifth ring might need a cover? Time was tight. With the distance between the fifth ring and the white hole, it would take no more than 3 to 4 months. And this was without considering the acceleration of the fifth ring continent. Under the changes of nature, even with the most powerful cultivation force of mankind, it was actually very difficult to prevent certain disasters from happening. Similar tragedies were not uncommon in the universe. Worlds collided, planets were destroyed, and people died. Stars exploded and burned the world into purgatory. Meteors swept across the world and smashed it into a sieve. These coincidences in the universe were not coincidences. They were inevitable after the unrestrained expansion of the human world. There were too many humans like locusts. Tragedies followed closely behind. However, the ones that were left in everyone's memories and records of the universe's history were mostly small, unknown worlds. It was certain that there were many more worlds like this that were destroyed by nature. They could not even leave a mark in the universe's history. Large-scale cultivation worlds were better because they had the ability to resist nature. Just like the fifth ring continent, its unique way of moving was destined to be much more dangerous than the worlds that operated on fixed orbits. If it was a world without cultivation power, the fifth ring continent would have been smashed beyond recognition after 20,000 years. It was because of the powerful cultivation power that it was safe. But this time, something big happened. Chapter 23:15. They had special channels to contact their own demi-immortals. They would only use it as a last resort, just like the current situation. Whether it was the interior or the exterior. Before the demi-immortals returned, they needed to make arrangements for the fifth ring. It involved all the orthodoxies in the fifth ring. None of them dared to do anything half-heartedly. Of course, the ones in control of the situation were still a few orthodoxies. They knew that time was tight, so the higher-ups of the fifth ring quickly came up with a plan. They would transfer the cultivation seeds, the foundation establishment gene Dan, into the void and leave them on the floating raft to await orders. Most of the Yuanying and perfected cultivators would erect a protective shield over the fifth ring. It would provide the fifth ring with the greatest protection regardless of whether it was a white hole or a black hole. One of the prerequisites was to believe that Lu Xiaoyi could change the transformation of a white hole into a black hole. Then, could the fifth ring still be saved? No one mentioned the mortals. It was impossible to transfer a population of 10 billion people. Not to mention 3 months, even 30,000 years wouldn't be enough. There was no way to change the focus. How would you transfer the rich and powerful? Strong and strong? Old and young? Male and female? In the face of life and death, who was more noble? Who was more lowly? Women were more qualified than men? Children deserved to live more than their parents? Without such a standard, it would only cause chaos. So, it was better to live and die together. At least their spirits were still there, and their hearts wouldn't scatter. So, the fifth ring cultivators decided that cultivators and mortals should live together. This seemed like a stupid method, but no one thought that it shouldn't be done. In fact, everyone thought that this was the only way. If Lu Xiaoyi didn't fulfill his responsibility, the fifth ring cultivators would be buried with him. The fifth ring cultivators didn't consider this possibility because Lu Hongxian had never disappointed them, whether it was his personal achievements or the two universe wars. The fifth ring cultivators believed in him as much as they believed in themselves. In other words, they might still collide with a white hole? Or what kind of celestial phenomenon it would become? It wouldn't become a black hole that could swallow planets, because Lu Hongxian was inside. If they thought about it this way, they would be faced with the problem of how to deal with the collision. The white hole could still be a white hole, or could it change its form? It couldn't just disappear because of the conservation of energy. It was impossible for it to transform into a physical astronomical phenomenon. It would still be a manifestation of an energy field. In that case, there was the possibility of a collision. What they had to guard against was the possibility of violent cosmic rays, electromagnetic beams, high temperature, extreme cold, darkness, and even the atmosphere being shattered. There were too many possibilities, too many cruelties, but it was still much better than colliding with an equally huge physical planet. They still had a chance to survive. This was what cultivators had to work hard for. Chang Jin roared, 3 layers of defense. The first layer will be given to the half-immortals who are about to return. They will build a grand barrier for the 5 rings. The second level was a group of true monarchs. Under the grand membrane of heaven and earth, the true monarch had to build a second line of defense. The third floor was Yuanying. They were going to set up a regional defense, concentrate the population in the cities. Then, they would build a dome over the city. Everyone, do your part. I only have one thing to say. Defend your positions. If you can't stop him, then you can die for your cause. No one refuted and no one cheered. In the eyes of these silent cultivators, there was only their usual firmness. A true monarch of a small sect smiled and said, "It's nothing. It's just like the 2 universe wars, but the opponent has changed from living beings to nature. We are all veterans, so we can withstand it." The 5 rings had never yielded nor given up. This was the character of the 5 rings. It was nothing. They were already used to it. Time was of the essence. With the 5 rings' joint decree, the entire continent began to boil. For a domain that had been preparing for war all year round, all of this was not so clueless. This was the good thing about a realm controlled by the cultivation world. There was no wrangling and no procrastination. Under the order, thousands of mortals began to bring their families and gather in the nearest city. Mischievous? This was not a problem for cultivators. There were plenty of ways to deal with it. Not wanting to leave home? Hiding in a cellar? Deep in the mountains? Even a mouse could not hide from a divine sense, let alone a human. A population of 10 billion was indeed very dangerous. But don't forget the number of cultivators in a cultivation planet like the 5 rings. Which city and which region did not have a large number of low-level cultivators? In addition, there was an even larger number of reserve Qi cultivators. Personnel, food, accommodation, water, sanitation, everything was arranged in an orderly manner. The large number of low-level cultivators played their roles perfectly. There was no need to hide the news. For such a big matter, the more it was hidden, the worse it would be, and the easier it would cause chaos. It was precisely because they were clear about what might happen that everyone was more willing to stand up and bear their share of responsibility. This was a realm disaster. When a realm disaster was about to happen, no one could stay out of it. Of course, severe punishment was also necessary in order to restrain some daring people who wanted to make a fortune. More than 10 days later, half-immortals began to return to the realm. This was the second time in 100 years that they had returned to the realm. Compared to the celebration of the first birthday, this time, it was the real omen of a disaster. With the return of the half-immortals, the great barrier of heaven and earth was in intense preparation. The establishment of a great barrier of heaven and earth was a very common phenomenon in the cultivation world of the universe. There was a set of familiar systems. In the beginning, the establishment of the great barrier of heaven and earth required at least 3/5 decay cultivators to support the three realms. Of course, there were many other reasons, such as the size of the realm and the number of people, but at least 3 was the minimum. With the development of the cultivation civilization and the rapid progress, these conditions were also slightly reduced due to the continuous improvement in technology. For example, in a small realm, 3/4 decay cultivators could barely support the existence of a great barrier. However, for a large domain like the fifth ring, 3/4 and 5th blight cultivators were far from enough. They needed more. This was never a problem for the fifth ring. They just didn't want to, not that they couldn't. Just like now, they had to consider this most stable and effective defense method. The Great Barrier of Heaven and Earth was still limited in its effect against absolute large physical collisions, but it was effective against some energy bodies like rays and beams. This was why they had to establish the Great Barrier of Heaven and Earth as soon as possible. When passing through energy fields like white holes, the main threat was similar to rays. Most importantly, the Great Barrier of Heaven and Earth was the best barrier to protect the planet's atmosphere from being lost. If the 5 rings safely passed through the energy field, but the atmosphere was gone, then it would be better to just be smashed to death. Chapter 23:16. In the half-immortal realm, 5th ring cultivators had no problem. But this time, there were no more than 40 half-immortals who returned. For the time being, there were only 20 or so half-immortals, because many of them went to the Yellow Dragon Land. For the cultivators who went to the Yellow Dragon Land, there was no way to transmit information from the inner and outer scenic skies. If they flew there, it would take 20 to 30 years. But this was not certain. Just like how Lu Xiaoyi and his friends contacted each other in an emergency, they and their respective sects also had similar method. As long as a 5th ring half-immortal in the Yellow Dragon Land knew the news, the other half-immortals would know as well. If they were slower, they might need a bit of luck. But 20 or so half-immortals were enough to support the great world membrane of the 5th ring. It was an emergency, so there was no reason to wait for everyone to gather. The 5th ring domain was gradually showing signs of accelerating. Just like a wanderer returning home after a long journey, they always had to run faster at the door. The responsibilities of the half-immortals did not need others to worry about them. They were all cultivators who could not be more mature. They were very clear about what they should do and what they should not do. They also sent people to the White Hole to investigate and see if they could do something with their abilities in other directions. The perfected monarchs also did not need others to worry about them. The perfected monarchs were preparing to build a second overall defense circle under the Great World Membrane. All kinds of preparations were needed, including the choice of formation, the preparation of resources, the cooperation between each other, and so on. The Yuanying were assigned to a human city every 2 people. They would use their own abilities to support the large and small cities with their own protective shield. It was a 3-dimensional defensive formation, which was also the limit of what the cultivators could do. Different from war, there were not too many tactical arrangements here. The focus was on breaking through the defense and the overall balance. Mortals did not need to worry because they were passive and had to do it even if they did not want to. In the world of cultivators, mortals still had some understanding of the power of cultivators. They would not think that it was unreasonable and would always be in awe of it. But there were also some demons. It was the huge group of Foundation Establishment Jin Dan cultivators. According to the overall arrangement of the leadership of the 5th ring, the seed plan was always an indispensable part of the cultivators of the 5th ring as a backup program for every boundary change. It was easy for them to execute it. A complete seed plan was to place these foundation establishment Jin Dan seeds in different realms of the cultivation alliance. However, it was too late to do so now because there were no enemies. Therefore, the temporary plan was to have these seeds rise into the air and wait for orders. They would wait for the results in the void, and then decide whether to return safely or go far away. This was a very normal backup plan, but this time, the foundation establishment Jin Dan chose to refuse to cooperate. No one knew who had the audacity to start this movement of non-cooperation. In any case, no matter which orthodoxy or power, no one in the entire fifth ring could afford to gather these small cultivators. They were scattered across the various cities of the fifth ring. Under the city barriers set up by the Yuanying, the Jin Dan cultivators set up large tents, while the foundation establishment cultivators set up small tents. They were all using their own methods to help this realm. Even if they were unable to withstand a single blow from the cosmic rays, they had their own arguments. After passing through the first 3 layers of defense, how much damage would the remaining damage be? Perhaps it would be so small that it would be just enough to cause damage to mortals. In that case, what they were doing was meaningful. Whether it was using cheap formation plates, magic weapons, or their own meager magic power, perhaps there were seeds who were willing to listen to the sect's arrangements and leave. However, under the great tide, no one could leave now. Leaving would be a betrayal to all the low and middle-level cultivators. The fifth ring's 3-dimensional defense had been forcefully reduced from 3 layers to 5 layers. The great cultivators were speechless at everything that had happened. The great cultivators had the duty to fight to the death for the realm, but the small cultivators didn't? In the face of a disaster, there might be differences in ability, but there was no difference in willpower. In fact, thinking about it carefully, if the fifth ring half-immortal Yuanying cultivators were completely wiped out in the face of a natural disaster, what was the point of leaving these seeds behind? They would just drag out an ignoble existence. This was not the character of the people of the fifth ring. Requests for instructions from various orthodoxies came in like snowflakes. They were all asking how to deal with this situation. Should they use force? Qing Yangzi let out a long sigh. He knew that what was done could not be undone. Nothing was more important than the fifth ring now. If they used force, they would destroy many precious things instead. Don't worry about them. If they must be destroyed, then let's all go together. The fifth ring was accelerating. They were heading in the direction of the white hole. Everything was clear now. This was not a man-made disaster, but a natural disaster. Perhaps it was a punishment for the fifth ring's plundering of the universe all these years? Perhaps they had to help the people of Sirius pay back this evil debt. The approaching change of the epoch had caused countless changes in the universe. However, no one expected the fifth ring to take the lead in this change, becoming the first cultivation realm in the universe to suffer a disaster. This unforeseen event was almost unavoidable. So what if they knew about it earlier? Could it stop a super-large realm from running for its life? Could it stop the white hole from turning into a black hole? In fact, it was still the current response. The people of the fifth ring would still not run, but choose to fight head-on. From the peak half-immortals to the small foundation establishment cultivators, more half-immortals rushed back, including Qing Xian and the other 2. They had been informed by the other fifth ring half-immortals in the land of the Yellow Dragon that something big had happened to the fifth ring. They had rushed back and finally rushed back to stay with their home planet. Everyone was powerless against the evolution of the white hole. The extremely powerful repulsive force refused to allow any cultivators of any realm to enter. At this time, the white hole had already entered the late stage of changing roles with the black hole. Outside interference was meaningless. I shouldn't have left. Qing Xian had cultivated for more than 3,000 years, but he had never regretted it so much. He regretted that he had obeyed the orders of the Sanqing alliance too much. As a result, His home planet, his sect, and his friends were in danger. Resentment grew in his heart. This was accumulated over a long period of time. Now that it had reached a critical point, he did not know what he would do if something really happened to the fifth ring. Was this the pain before the arrival of the new epoch? Why did I have to be so anxious to set up that Tao tablet? What's the difference between a few decades earlier and a few decades later? She was also a little dazed. If the fifth ring was gone, it meant that all of them were gone. Who could still establish the Tao in such deep remorse? The foundation was not there. Yan Cheng was full of regret. This temper of mine. I really deserve to die. Little E, you must hold on. After this, your senior sister will listen to you in the future. In fact, even if the three of them were present, they would not be able to change anything. Even if everyone went to the white hole together, the final result would definitely be Lu Xiaoyi going in alone. Because their Tao realm was far inferior to this guy, they did not know how to deal with the most crucial Tao realm of the black white hole. But when danger came, it was always good to have friends together, right? Chapter 23:17. P.S. Reboot 99 Sir D. Duo's new book. I welcome everyone's support. The grand membrane of heaven and earth was established. With the support of almost 40 demigods, the power of the membrane was many times stronger than the normal operation of the membrane. The monarch's heaven and earth formation was established. It was within the grand membrane of heaven and earth. Almost 2,000 monarchs would provide the formation with an endless supply of magical energy. This was something that mortals could not see. Every city's barrier was established. 1,000 feet above the tens of thousands of cities, large and small, tens of thousands of nascent soul cultivators were displaying their strength. They were the most powerful guardian deities that mortals could see. The Jin Dan's formation was established. Although the protection was limited and the range was limited, in every city, every square, every house it was clearly visible and within reach. The Foundation establishment cultivators had used all their means. It could be an instrument, a talisman, or an air shield. It could not hide many people, but they were the most flexible tents. Even mortals could clearly feel the changes around them. It was not just the tense atmosphere, but also some practical feelings. They could feel their bodies becoming heavier, which was a subtle change in gravity. They could feel that the clouds in the sky were rapidly surging in the same direction, which was caused by the deflection of the 5 rings under the immense inertia. The birds and beasts seemed to have realized something and hid in their nests one after another. When the 5 rings continent changed the rhythm of its operation for millions of years, all living things realized the great danger after this change. But they did not have wings and could not leave this cage. But fortunately, those who had the ability to leave did not give up on them. It is our fortune to be born in such a galaxy. Qin Xian was a little melancholy, because he could have done more for this hero's domain. But we have not done enough for it. I've always thought that among the 4 of us, little E is the most unreliable and irresponsible one. But now it seems that I was wrong. He may be the one who likes to joke the most, but he is also the most responsible. When he is needed, he will always be at the most appropriate position. A group of people stood outside the grand membrane of heaven and earth, facing the direction of the white hole. It was as if they were standing on the bow of a huge ship, looking at a towering iceberg that was getting closer and closer. At this time, they had already lost the helm. In their eyes, the white hole was already right in front of them. They could even see the tiny energy swirls inside clearly. The intense rays of light hit the membrane of heaven and earth, only to be broken down and absorbed by the supreme defense system of the world of cultivators. For the time being, these energy rays would not pose a threat to the living beings in the domain. The grand membrane of heaven and earth could completely deal with them. However, this was only the beginning. The real outcome would be revealed when the white hole and the black hole came into direct contact. This was the final test to see if their 5-layered defense system was sturdy or not. Less than 3 days, less than 30 hours. We are going to collide with this monster of nature. I've lived for more than 5,000 years, but I never thought that there would be a day where I would stand on my own celestial body and watch it collide with the most bizarre phenomenon in the universe. Qin Yangzi sighed. Not only him, but also his old friends. Who would have thought that in their magnificent lives they would encounter such a miraculous scene? Guandu also sighed. I've lived for more than 5,000 years, and I've never encountered such a predicament. From the moment I learned the sword technique, I didn't even have the chance to use my sword when facing an enemy that threatened me. A swordsman can't give the last moment of his life to his flying sword. How can others endure this? Chong Jin's eyes were clear. I've lived for 6,000 years, the two old friends beside him said in unison, less than 6,000 years. And your urine is yellow only because you soaked in yellow eagle wine all day long. Chong Jin laughed. More or less. If you keep the land, you lose the people. If you keep the people, you lose the land. I thought this was a very simple concept, but now I understand that in human emotions, it's not as good as the hot-blooded impulse to stake everything on a single throw. Tell me, if the worst-case scenario really happens, how will the history of cultivators in the future evaluate our collision? Will they feel the unity of the people of the 5 rings and not give up? Or will they laugh at the stupidity of the people of the 5 rings? No one answered, because they all knew that it must be the latter. This was the truth of the cultivation world. Shishi also opened his mouth. I've lived for 3,000 years, seeing the 3 old people looking at him with disdain. He smiled and changed his word. Although I'm still young, elders, shouldn't we consider more realistic things now? There are less than 3 days left. The white hole's transformation into a black hole doesn't show any signs of stopping. If little e can't stop this transformation in the end, this is very normal for a half-immortal. I've never heard of a half-immortal from the main world being able to change the laws of an active cave image. If it doesn't change, the white hole will still become a black hole. Then, wouldn't everything we've done be meaningless? This was a very realistic and heart-wrenching assumption, and it was also an assumption with a very high probability. If it really turned into a black hole, only God knew what would happen after the defense of the 5 rings was completely swallowed into the strange and unpredictable wormhole. The atmosphere would definitely be stripped away, and then whether or not they could defend against the rays would be meaningless. All the mortals would soon die, and then it would be the Foundation establishment Jindan. It was unknown how long perfected Yuanying could last. Only the half-immortals theoretically had a glimmer of hope to survive. In other words, if Lu Xiaoyi didn't do what he should before the 5 rings crashed into the cave image, everyone actually had another choice. Give up on the mortals, and the cultivators could leave on their own. This also meant that apart from Lu Xiaoyi, who had already entered, the rest of the 5 rings cultivators wouldn't die. They could also take away a large number of reserve seed. If they changed realms, they might be able to make a comeback. The new era was coming, and who didn't want to see it clearly? Shishi gathered his courage. I want to know, do you have such a backup plan? Strictly speaking, it wasn't that Shishi was afraid of death, but that there was indeed another option. He definitely wasn't the only one who had considered this option. Every cultivator, regardless of their realm, had probably considered it, but he had the courage to say it out loud. It was difficult for others to answer such a statement, except for the supreme Chong Jin. He stared hatefully at the disciple he was most proud of, and his heart was filled with disappointment. Among the 4 ancient arts of the interior, he didn't expect that his supreme origin, Shi, was the worst when it came to state of mind. Yanqing saw that there was something wrong with his expression and explained, "Senior, What Senior Shishi meant was that we, the half-immortals, might be able to pass through the cave images alive. As for the others, Senior Brother can't bear to see you like this. Chapter 23:18. Chong Jin was not courteous at all. Then why didn't you say anything, Xiao Yi? Qing Xian didn't say anything either? Xiao Yi didn't even need to mention, he went in long ago. Don't think we don't know, even if dozens of you went in, it's hard to say how many of you could survive. Once the old man's temper flared up, no one could stop him. He had the right to do so, because the disciple in front of him was personally taught by him. You're just afraid of death. Don't give me any other high-sounding reasons. Alright, then let me ask you. When is the most suitable time to make the decision? How many hours earlier is the most suitable time? If it's too early, we'll all run away. What if Xiao Yi did it in the end? Cave images will change very quickly. This is something everyone knows. Then, the bounded domain will still be there, but everyone will die. If it's too late, how many can run away? How should we explain to those little cultivators in the city, in the square, and on the street who gave their all? Tell them not to care about their family and friends, to reincarnate into a good body in the next life, and not to be a person of the fifth ring? There's no backup plan, because it's long past the time when the plan can be carried out smoothly. We only have one plan, which is to believe in Xiao Yi, and then fight to the death with this damn cave image. Qing Yangzi interrupted. Old friend, you've lost your composure. Allowing people to raise different opinions doesn't mean that the young people are afraid. These are two different things. The direction of a bounded domain will definitely have different opinions. Only then can you constantly correct yourself in the process of moving forward, and not be impulsive, and everyone has to follow you. Daring to raise different opinions shows that they've grown up, and have the consciousness to think independently. Don't think that others haven't raised similar opinions. Qing Xian has already told me, just not in front of everyone like Shi. Guan Du was even more direct. You're already so old, and you claim to have lived for 6,000 years, yet you're still so impatient. Who else but you? Let me tell you, this is only because Xiao Yi isn't here. If he was, everyone would have already split up and gone their separate ways. Such an atmosphere indeed made people restless, but Chong Jin's loss of composure was not only because of Shi, but also because of his future path, and more because of the exterior heaven half-immortals beside him. He couldn't give any advice to those old half-immortals who were older than him. If these old half-immortals asked him this question, how should he answer? Could he still be so resolute and decisive? Thus, he could only use his personal disciple as an example to warn the others. On the surface, he was scolding Shi, but in fact, he was scolding those old half-immortals. Of course, Qing Xian had never mentioned such a plan to Qing Yangzi. No matter how unreliable Lu Xiaoyi was, it was impossible for him to break up his business. He was also saying this for the old half-immortals to hear. He was giving everyone a way out. In the face of life and death, there was no difference between nobility and lowliness, since they were living beings, who didn't fear death and wanted to live. If everyone had one, there would be no need to feel ashamed. Even at the last moment, the three old men were still using their life experiences to teach everyone a lesson. Naturally, many half-immortals were able to see through this. For example, a supreme half-immortal didn't say anything, but he glared at his disciple fiercely and said, "Damn it, you even dare to insult your master?" Qing Xian sighed. In the group of 5 rings half-immortals, his position was second only to Lu Xiaoyi. If we plan now, not only will it be too hasty, it will also cause the entire 5 rings to lose their spirit. And just like what Senior Chong Jin said, we can't decide on a time to make a decision. We can't do it early and we can't do it late. Instead of being in a dilemma, we might as well stake it all on one throw. I have known Xiaoyi for almost 3,000 years, and he has never failed in important matters. Therefore, everyone should do their part well. This is the best way to get through this crisis. I firmly believe that the 5 rings will not die. Otherwise, Li Wuya would have reminded us to move 20,000 years ago. This last sentence was truly a reassuring pill. Even though he had been gone for 20,000 years, Li Wuya's reputation was still at its peak. That's right, how could a Daluo Golden Immortal who was able to go down to the lower realm 20,000 years ago and single-handedly trigger the change of the entire universe not see the danger in his own realm? Everyone became very confident. Only Yen Tu sighed in her heart. She was very clear that Li Wuya would not see so far ahead, because he would never put himself in the role of a nanny. If I have the ability, I will be happy. If you don't have the ability, then you deserve it. However, there are talents in every generation, and each of them will lead the world for thousands of years. In this era of change, countless monsters appeared out of nowhere. Qing Xian was one of them. Not to mention other things, just by looking at his methods of turning a deer into a horse, and using the tiger's skin as a banner, he was definitely an influential figure. What about me? Bulien smiled bitterly as she came back to life. After reincarnating for so many years, she was actually still her, the simple her. There was nothing wrong with watching the monsters stir up trouble. As for the 5 rings disaster this time, she did not care. It was just adding a magnificent stroke to Lu Xiaoyi's resume. He would definitely stop the cave image, and the 5 rings would definitely be able to break through. Because she knew too well that what Xiaoyi had always been thinking about was that his legend in the future would not suddenly be abandoned. No more nonsense, everyone quietly looked at the cave image that was getting closer and closer, waiting for the flip of the cards when the collision happened. No one had experience in this area. An individual cultivator passing through a cave image and a huge realm passing through a cave image were 2 different concepts. Under the size, how much of an interference would it have on the stability of the cave image's energy field? If the cave image's energy field collapsed into disorder, how much of an impact would it have on the realm's atmosphere, spirit veins, young realms, and vitality magnetic field? These were all impossible to calculate. There was no conclusion. It was an unknown journey. Time passed by like a year. Surprisingly, as they got closer to the white hole, things seemed to be developing on the positive side. Although everyone could feel that the cave image's transformation was close at hand, it was dragging on and not transforming, making people involuntarily fantasize. Could it be that the cave image would only begin to transform after the 5 rings passed through the white hole? Maybe this was a joke played by nature? Could it be that Lu Xiaoyi played a role in delaying the process? As long as the cave image did not change its nature during the transmigration and did not turn into a black hole, then the 5 rings could be saved. Hope quietly grew in the hearts of the 5 rings cultivators. If they could live, who would be willing to die? On the eve of the arrival of the new era, before the new world lifted its veil, there were still 40 hours left. The interior of the white hole was still violently churning, but its basic nature had not changed. There were only 20 hours left. It was still the same as it was on the verge of transformation. There were already some perfected lords who were not steady enough, who could not suppress their ecstasy. To them, as long as they could break through, even if they had to pay a price, it was acceptable. There were still 6 hours left. The cave image that was already within reach suddenly changed. The once bright mushroom cloud vortex disappeared and rapidly began to transform into a pitch-black, bottomless hole. More and more black dots appeared, gathering and growing larger. The cave image's nature had changed. At the last moment, the heavenly Tao had chosen to abandon them. Chapter 23:19. There was no time in the mountains, but there was also no time in the caves. Lu Xiaoyi liked caves, but he never thought that he would have to return to the furnace in a cave ever since he was born. The cosmic cave image was the most unpredictable, mysterious, surging, and unfathomable of all the astronomical phenomena in the universe. The cultivation world had existed for millions of years, but no cultivator had studied the cosmic cave image thoroughly. All of them were just superficial and general discussions. The first reason was the ability, the second reason was the danger of the cosmic cave image, and the third reason was that studying it was of no practical help to cultivators. Even for someone as studious as Liu Xiaoyi, if he wasn't forced to this point, he would never have thought of studying the cosmic cave image. But this time, he couldn't avoid it. After entering the wormhole, he spent some time to find a balance point between the white hole and black hole. He stopped there, which was also the key point for him to change or stop the transformation of the cosmic cave image. From then on, he began to devour the Tao realm to seek resonance with the three Tao realms of the black hole, white hole, and wormhole. This was why he dared to barge in so confidently. But soon, he realized that regardless of the Tao realm's power, the first problem he faced here was how to survive. To be precise, he had to let his body adapt to the energy field here. Otherwise, his body would have been killed by the intense radiation before the Tao realm resonated, and all his cells would lose their original vitality. To him, from the moment he entered the white hole, he had been using his own elemental energy to resist the radiation that was everywhere around him. The deeper he went, the stronger the radiation, and the more elemental energy he had to use to protect his life. At this point, the radiation level had almost reached the limit he could withstand. The problem was, if he used all his elemental energy to resist the radiation, how much energy would he have left to activate the Tao realm to affect the black hole and white hole? To solve the problem of the cosmic cave image transformation, he had to let his body adapt to the environment here without much elemental energy. This was the deeper reason why he began to transform his body after entering. If it was someone else, they would have died long ago. It was even more impossible for them to transform their body to adapt here. The body was a treasure, but it was also the most intricate life form in the world. How could it be changed so easily? However, he could change it because he had already changed it once when he reached the nascent soul stage. His body had the foundation of the Tao realm of the small universe. However, in the 2,000 years after he reached the nascent soul stage, he had never thought about this. Now, he had to move even if he didn't want to. His life was more important. He had never thought of changing his body in the midst of radiation. According to a certain memory, how many Röntgens had the radiation intensity reached? He was afraid that even wearing anti-radiation clothing would not be able to withstand it. But now, he was using his physical body to withstand it. He did not lose any hair, nor did his organs fail. This was the superpower that cultivation brought to him. How do I change my body? Of course, he wouldn't choose to resist. The best method was to let nature take its course and transform his body into an insight image. Time was of the essence, and he didn't have the time to think about it. He instinctively made a choice. He changed his mouth to the direction of the black hole that could only be entered and not exited. His esophagus and intestines worked towards the direction of the wormhole. As for the white hole that could only be exited and not entered, he could only use the astral gate to replace it. Could he find a more suitable part on his body? If such a change was successful in the future, it was hard for him to imagine what kind of freak his Dharma power would become. I'll swallow you whole. I'll blow you up with my fart. It seemed very cool too. He was forced to do it. Just the transformation of his body alone took him nearly 2 months. Of course, this process was also a process of familiarizing himself with the insight image. It didn't seem excessive. When the transformation of his body was successful, He, who had transformed into a small insight image, no longer needed the support of elemental energy to resist the radiation. This was because he himself was the source of the radiation. Thus, he could free up all his elemental energy to control the devouring Tao realm and add it to the ongoing transformation of the insight image. Because his body was compatible with the environment, the entire insight image was one. The black hole, white hole, and wormhole, all the changes were under his control. However, control did not equate to control. In terms of mechanism, he was sure that he could control this process. He only needed to slow down its progress. It didn't matter what it became after the fifth ring's domain passed through. Although he didn't know the situation outside and the fifth ring's response, he wasn't worried about this. There were countless knowledgeable supremes on the fifth ring and the three old foxes. Any slight change in the domain's course would not be hidden from them. What he needed to do was to prevent the white hole from turning into a black hole when the fifth ring passed through. It didn't sound difficult, and it wasn't difficult in theory. However, the difficulty lay in his cultivation. It lay in the energy of the Tao realm that he could mobilize. Of course, it wasn't difficult to use a river to influence a river. However, if he wanted to influence a sea, it was wishful thinking. The insight image that he was in was a trinity. In terms of mass energy, it was far beyond his ability. Not to mention him, even if all the elemental energy of the fifth ring's half-immortals were added together, they wouldn't be able to contend against such a large-scale cosmic phenomenon. They weren't even on the same level. It was impossible to reverse or stop it. It was also very difficult to delay or stop it. The insight image moved firmly in its original direction with a fixed pace unique to natural astronomical phenomena. It was like the arrival of a new era, majestic and unstoppable. There wasn't much time left. Lu Xiaoyi estimated that the fifth ring would arrive within a month. If he couldn't do it, his own safety didn't matter. However, he wouldn't be able to see the 10 billion people on the fifth ring and the cultivators who were bound to live and die with the domain. He could even imagine the three old fellows and Qing Xian standing at the forefront of the fifth ring, their faces filled with unwavering determination. It was very silly. However, if it was him, he would do the same. He would immerse his mind in the insight image, search for every possibility and try them one by one. He would constantly fail and adjust. Even temporary setbacks couldn't stop his firm confidence. After cultivating for 3,000 years, if he had to talk about what kind of temperament he had cultivated, it would only be one: indomitable. Time passed by mercilessly. It didn't slow down because of his hope. After trying many methods and failing, he decided to stake it all on one throw. It couldn't be reversed. It couldn't be delayed. Everything was destined. Then, let nature take its course. Let the changes happen naturally. Let him see if he could add anything to it. There were 4 holes in the universe. Among them, the black hole, white hole, and wormhole were a set of 3. However, there was another type of hole, called the gray hole. The gray hole was the result of a star failing to transform into a black hole. During the process of transforming from a star to a black hole, if the star's radius couldn't compress to the extent of a black hole, it would form a gray hole. Chapter 23:20. A star would only become a black hole after being compressed to a certain value. Anything could give up halfway. Then, a star might take a break after being compressed halfway. Therefore, it hadn't reached the standard of a black hole, so it was called a gray hole. Gray was lighter than black. A gray hole had some of the characteristics of a black hole and a white hole. It could absorb and spit out, but it wasn't as extreme as a black hole. It was a half-finished product, but it couldn't be said to be a defective product, because in the long river of time, it could also become a black hole. I'm still on the way, that's roughly what it meant. What Lu Xiaoyi wanted to do was to keep it on the way. This was a dangerous gamble. He had tried countless times before finding a way to use the smallest amount of Tao state power to control the progress of the insight image. It was also his last resort. At the end of the day, he had overestimated the difficulty of trying to reverse the most terrifying and mysterious phenomenon in the universe all by himself. Although he already understood the core mechanism of the Tao state, it felt like he was always a little short. There was still one last layer of mystery left. Just like when you treat people to a meal, give them flowers, and send them endless love letters. But the insight image still persisted. It was easier to control the insight image, but it was even more difficult. The insight image continued to change according to the existing rules. Because he had a rough grasp of the insight image's mechanism, at the last moment, he also calculated the time when the white hole would transform into a black hole. It would be 20 hours later. At the same time, because there was a huge celestial body outside the white hole, it had a significant impact on the white hole's magnetic pole. This made him understand everything. The five-ring continent was approaching from the outside. The time of arrival was also exactly 20 hours later. Was this a coincidence? Yes. Also no. The five-ring continent, which was so far away and had traveled for tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years, arrived at the same time as the insight image's transformation. No one would believe it if you said it wasn't a coincidence. But it was indeed a coincidence. Because the Creator had put the five-ring star's nucleus and the insight image's trinity together to operate. In other words, the proximity of the five-ring continent was one of the core reasons for the insight image's transformation. If the five-ring continent wasn't close, the white hole would always be a white hole. Similarly, the transformation of the insight image also determined that the five-ring continent would be close. Just like the north and south magnetic poles, they would eventually be attracted to each other. It was because he understood this that the insight image's insight image was finally revealed. He had found the source of the cave image's transformation. In that case, it was clear as day how to deal with it. There was no point in dealing with it in advance, and he couldn't do it either. However, when the five-ringed planet core crashed into the cave image, and several aspects intertwined to produce a chemical reaction, it might be the most intense stage, but it was also the moment he could take advantage of. What he needed to do now was to make preparations and change some things at the most crucial moment so that the transformation of the cave image would never be completed. The cave image trinity formed by the black hole, white hole, and wormhole would become a trinity formed by the two gray holes and wormhole, thereby achieving another dynamic balance. Now that he had a theory and a goal, all that was left was to fight. In Lu Xiaoyi's 3,000 years of cultivation, he had experienced such a scene too many times. It was so many times that he didn't feel any emotional fluctuations. It was as normal as eating and drinking. He was still in the mood to guess what kind of state the people on the fifth ring were in. Then, he suddenly realized that fifth ring cultivators could have other reactions as well. For example, leaving without a care? Even if the fifth ring was the domain of the long-tested heroes, it didn't mean that they would enter even if they knew it would lead to death. The most likely scenario was that they would leave a part of their power to bring out the seeds, and then on a voluntary basis, a part of the cultivators would live and die with the domain. It was unimaginable that a domain with 10 billion people and tens of millions of cultivators would go hand in hand to the Yellow Springs. Especially when he had placed his final control of the situation at the last stage. How much determination did it take to make such a scale of population to face death with equanimity? This was unrealistic. It was inhumane. Sacrifice must be meaningful. Meaningless sacrifice was stupid. If he was outside, if he knew that they were rushing towards a black hole, he wouldn't agree to do it for the sake of courage. Demigods might have a chance of survival, but those below the level of perfected Lord had no chance at all. He believed that if Qing Xian was outside, he wouldn't agree to such a life and death situation either, because this had already broken away from the values of life and death. It was a helpless compromise. I have no choice, so I will die with everyone. Is that not wrong? This was not the philosophy of a real cultivator. The philosophy of a real cultivator was, I can't do anything this time, but I will preserve my body so that the same tragedy will not happen again. Sometimes, bravery and cowardice were only one step away. Bravery could also be a kind of irresponsible cowardice, but cowardice could also be a kind of bravery to endure humiliation. Philosophical questions were so brain-burning. In fact, the deciding factor was still whether you were afraid in the face of death. Should you be afraid? Of course, you should be afraid. Cultivators should always be in awe of the universe, and not be careless and unafraid of death. The jet flow in the wormhole had begun to become chaotic. It had changed from a one-way black hole to a white hole, but now the white hole also had jet radiation flowing towards the black hole. As time passed, this trend became more and more obvious. He could tell that when the jet flow of the black hole and white hole reached a balance, the addition of the fifth ring would completely break this fragile balance. Then, the white hole would become a black hole, and the black hole would become a white hole. During this change, his body also changed along with it. The transformation of his body was still continuing. This was the cornerstone to ensure that he could unleash his greatest power. Feeling the changes of the Trinity in the cave and adjusting the Trinity in the small universe in his body was a wonderful feeling. It was as if he was the cave image, and the cave image was him. He had already released the devouring Tao realm and merged it with the changes of the cave image. It did not interfere and went with the flow, waiting for the final moment to exert its power. He knew that he had to do something. He had to strengthen the confidence of the cultivators outside and let them know that no matter how scary the cave image looked, there were people working hard inside. He would not give up, and they should not give up either. If he gave up, the fifth ring would become a part of history. It would become a temporary glory, and then slowly be rendered into a bandit astral body in the long river of history, bearing an eternal infamy. If they gave up, everything that Lu Xiaoyi had done would be greatly reduced. Countless mortals would die from the lack of protection from the radiation, and a large number of people would be left with sequelae and live in pain for the rest of their lives. He had to remind them. Everyone had to do their best. Chapter 23-21. P.S. I peed today and peed out a rock. It's the size of a green bean. Tell me, should I be happy? Or unhappy? Could it be that Old Fallen has also cultivated to Insight Realm? I need to buy tickets to replenish my body. There were less than 6 hours left. However, the changes in the heavenly insight caused everyone to feel despair. The white hole was unwaveringly transforming into a black hole, and they were unwaveringly advancing towards the black hole of the white hole. The peak strength of fifth ring cultivators, nearly 40 half-immortals, and thousands of perfected monarchs could all see this change and understand what it meant. No one was willing to be the first to speak, but most of them had the urge to speak. Just as Lu Xiaoyi thought, human nature was in a painful struggle at this moment. You can't say who is right and who is wrong, who is brave and who is cowardly. They had cultivated for thousands of years just to perish together like moths to a flame. They couldn't even find the enemy, because the enemy was the universe itself. There were tens of thousands of half-immortals here. They had cultivated painstakingly just to see the appearance of the new era. There were thousands of perfected monarchs here. The beginning of the new era was their beginning, a new life. Should it be moral coercion? Some were willing, some thought it wasn't worth it. What should cultivators do for mortals? Do they do their best until they die? Or do they do their best and stop before going too far? Cultivate for themselves? Or for others? If there weren't 10 billion people here, but only a few hundred or a few thousand people, would they still be so infatuated? Would there definitely be a qualitative change when the change in quantity reached a certain level? Could they even abandon the principles of cultivation? Could they even give up their lives, just to accompany mortals who had no blood ties with them? They might become heroes, but in the cultivation world, heroes should not exist at all. There was only one true essence of cultivation. Since ancient times there was only one self. Torment, incomparable torment. Everyone was in torment. Even the three old fellows who were unwilling to leave fell into deep thought. They were thinking that it might be worth it to exchange their remaining lifespan for this great fearlessness, but if they were to drag everyone with them, those young people who still had lofty ideals and a future, along with them, wouldn't it be too selfish to do so? But now that things had developed to this point, whoever spoke up might face the wrath of the public in the future, bearing infamy for the rest of your life, the karma of tens of billions of lives, and the mouths of the people that cannot be stopped, who is going to speak for you. It had already formed a trap. For those young people, they had been forced to the end of Mount Hua. They had nowhere to retreat and could only become a joke. Qing Xian took a deep breath and took a step forward. Fifth ring, do you have any doubts about my words? No one questioned it. Lu Xiaoyi was not around, so he was the most qualified. In the fifth ring, the only people who could decide the direction of a realm were the demigods. No matter how prestigious the three old men were, they didn't have the qualifications to stand out and say no. They would not stand out either because they had already stood out once and expressed their intentions clearly. The rest would be left to the youngsters. Because they were the future. Qing Xian's voice was hoarse. I won't discuss with anyone. Because there was no time. I say, let's all do it without any discount. Is that all right? Everyone nodded. Being able to stand out at such a time was a kind of responsibility. His choice not only determined the life and death of thousands of great cultivators, but also determined his own future. To be precise, no matter what decision he made, he would not end up well. Shi Shi and Yancheng also stood out side by side. They shared the responsibility because they knew very well what choice their companion would make. In the fifth ring, the three youngsters standing together represented the fifth ring. The rays blew up their hair, but their eyes were still bright and resolute. The old men looked at them from behind. Guandu sighed, they've all grown up. This is their era. I say, old man who has lived for 6,000 years, why aren't you angry anymore? Chong Jin glared at him. I'm not in the mood right now. You want me to glare? I won't. Qin Yangzi chuckled. Actually, it's quite easy if you don't make the decision. I've had the idea for thousands of years. Now that I see others suffering, I'm gloating? I'm thinking it's a pity that we're missing the most important person among the youngsters. If little E was here, what would he choose? Guandu snorted. I've told you long ago. Split up as luggage and disband as soon as possible. That thing is capable of doing that. Chong Jin nodded. We're old. We can't keep up with the times. Not only the Tao realm, but also the ideals. That's good. The new era should have new ideals. We can't cling to our old ways. This final journey should be taken by us old fellows, instead of dragging everyone to hell. To be honest, they were a little crazy in this response and lost their usual cold rationality. When the number of mortals exceeded a certain limit, it would naturally affect their rationality. There was no right or wrong. Qing Xian raised his voice. There are 6 more hours. I'll split it into 3 parts. In the next 2 hours, we'll continue to wait, waiting for a possible glimmer of hope. But the order must be passed to every Yuanying below, so that they can prepare to leave. Prepare the floating rafts. Every Yuanying is responsible for every cultivator in their city. Everyone was silent. When Qing Xian stood out, they knew that this would be the result. There might be people who disagreed, and there would definitely be people who disobeyed, but to most people, this was a rational decision. The fifth ring did not lack floating raft. To the Yuanying, this was a standard for everyone. In fact, just in case, when the mission was assigned, every Yuanying had a large enough raft, just in case there was a change in the plan. With tens of thousands of Yuanying squeezing on each raft, it was not difficult to bring out tens of millions of cultivators at once. The difficult part was that many people might refuse. In 2 hours, if the situation hasn't changed, all fifth ring cultivators are to get on the rafts and wait for orders. Tell them that this is a death order. Some people are not allowed to play the hero. If they wanted to bring them out, they had to bring them out. It was not voluntary. This was a decision made with a deep understanding of the human heart. If there was voluntary, there would be a loss of cohesion. If there were any changes, there would be a gap between those who risked their lives to stay and those who obeyed orders to leave, and the fifth ring would be artificially divided into two. This was the most fatal. At the last moment, Qing Xian's thinking was still meticulous. In 4 hours, all the rafts will be in the sky. Wait for the final order. Qing Xian spoke more and more fluently. What he thought would be difficult was easy to say. My decision will be made an hour before the fifth ring and the core of the cave image come into contact. As for the perfected cultivators, each orthodoxy will make their own arrangements. My suggestion is that at least half of them should go. If you're alone, then you have to go. Half immortals, it's up to you whether to leave or stay. I have no right to make arrangements. Shishi laughed at the side. Senior apprentice brother, this is 4 stages, okay? Are you so anxious that you don't even know how to count? There were a few bitter smiles. In fact, everyone understood that Qing Xian's arrangement could only mean one thing: he would not leave. The fifth ring was full of heroes. Chapter 23-22. The order was immediately given. To the Yuanying, this was a death order. They couldn't persist just because they wanted to, because they still had the responsibility of taking away Jin Dan's foundation establishment. At this time, the semi-militarized 5-ring system came into play. There were definitely complaints, such as changing orders and being as timid as mice, but an order was an order. The news began to spread to Jin Dan's level. They would be the main force to capture those rebellious and hot-blooded foundation establishment cultivators. But this order inevitably caused a devastating blow to the morale of the troops. It was difficult to have the best of both worlds. When an army packed their bags and prepared to leave, how could they fight? But Qing Xian was still unmoved. By making this decision, he had almost given himself a death sentence. Of course, he could live on easily, but he was destined to be tormented for the rest of his life. Because the death of 10 billion mortals was the result of his order. Even if he didn't give this order, it didn't make a difference. Because he couldn't get over it. You don't have to accompany me. This kind of thing should be shouldered by one person. You have your own responsibilities, such as the future. Looking at his 2 friends, Qing Xian felt helpless. Shishi sighed. I'm your assistant. Although I don't want to admit it, I didn't persist when I raised this issue, so I admit that you are more courageous than me. Actually, you and I shouldn't be shouldering this burden. It should be little E. He has a big heart. Not to mention 10 billion, even if it's a trillion, it's just a number to him. I can guess what he will say. How big of a problem can it be with so few people? Let's work overtime at night and create a new one. Qing Xian looked at Yanqing again. He and Shi were actually older than Yanqing, and they became half immortals earlier. However, due to Yanqing's reincarnation identity, although it was not appropriate to call her senior, it was more appropriate to call her senior apprentice sister. Senior, why are you doing this? Relatively speaking, if the 5 rings were to encounter such a disaster, the sword vein would be the hardest to deal with. You should stay, there are too many things for you to bear in the future. Yanqing pouted. You think I'm willing to stand out? I'm just expressing that the 3 families are working together. As for pressure, what pressure do I have? That's Little Yi's problem. I'm just there to support him. In my opinion, you should be prepared to stay in the same way you're prepared to run away. Why do you have to act so solemn and tragic? Can you die if you don't act? Take off your pants to release air, that's unnecessary. Qing Xian and Shi were speechless. Senior sister, when it comes to trusting little E, we are not as firm as you. I think that grandson still knows his limits, right? This was such a big matter, and the safety of tens of billions of people was at stake. They couldn't wait until the end to act just to pretend to be weak, right? This was a cave image, nothing else. I don't know what immortals are like, but in the history of the origin world, no one has ever been able to subdue a natural phenomenon like this. You still want to make a comeback at the last minute? Smokey snorted. Li Wuya was once my junior. Lu Xiaoyi too. In fact, they were essentially the same type of people. They were people who didn't care about the occasion. As long as they are high on their own, who cares if your universe is destroyed? What does it have to do with him? That's why I'm not worried. Soon, 2 hours had passed. The white hole, yes, it had now become a flower hole. It was like an ingrate with more white than black. It was getting closer and closer to them, as if it was within their reach. The grand membrane of heaven and earth was already feeling the pressure, but it was still bearable. The great cultivators outside the void were still silent, but the void was already in an uproar. Almost all the cities, all the Jindan, had adopted the same method. They used the excuse of discussing how to improve the city's defenses to hold a final meeting. Then, after gathering all the Foundation establishment cultivators, they would catch them all in one fell swoop. They would all be detained in the raft. They would directly take action without any notice. This was the only way to avoid causing chaos in the mortal realm. Even if they themselves were full of complaints, they would not be lenient. This was also the tradition of the 5 rings. Just like the army, you could complain, but you could only vent your complaints to your superiors. You could not express your dissatisfaction to those below you. This was the true essence of ensuring cohesion. In just 2 hours, on the vast continent of the 5 rings, all the Foundation establishment cultivators and above were loaded into the rafts and were on standby. This kind of mobility was rarely achieved in the realm, but for the 5 rings who were always on standby, it was very easy. The preparations in the realm were in full swing, but the atmosphere in the void outside the realm was oppressive. The transformation of the white hole into a black hole was increasing at a speed visible to the naked eye, without a trace of stopping. Everyone knew that if the black area occupied half of the area, this change would be irreversible even if an immortal came. Lu Qiuxian, not an immortal. Every perfected monarch and half-immortal was considering the problem of which path to take. From the perspective of their own Tao heart, from the perspective of their sect, from the perspective of life and death. If the opponent was a true cultivator, would there be so many considerations? They would just kill their way over. But the opponent was a cosmic phenomenon. The heavenly Tao gave them a difficult problem that had no correct answer. There is a mission that requires the 2 of you to carry out. Qing Xian was still doing things his way. In the last hour, if no half-immortal leaves, I need the 2 of you to lead the head of this deserter. Do you have the courage? This was the most difficult deserter in the world. She was very dissatisfied. Why us and not you? Qing Xian smiled. Because I have already done what I should do. And the 2 of you have not done what you should do. Yanqing did not care. Deal. If that time comes, I will lead the way. She spoke without hesitation, but her heart was not as relaxed as her appearance. After all, she was a half-immortal, and had a certain understanding of the cave image. If she did not take action now, she really could not think of a way to stop the white hole from turning into a black hole. In the surging undercurrent, each orthodoxy made their own arrangements for their perfected monarchs. Staying was a martyr, leaving was a burden, there was no difference in essence. Death was only a matter of a moment, but moving forward with a burden could be a matter of a lifetime, which was more important. Qing Xian did not ask in detail who was staying and who was leaving, it was not his responsibility. He only looked at the mushroom cloud that was getting closer and closer, the black and white intertwined, like a huge spotted dog. 1 hour. This was not a random time, because if the distance to the cave image was less than 1 hour, with the ability of the Yuanying, they might not be able to lead the seeds away from the attraction of the cave image. The key to the seed plan was these low and middle-level cultivators of various levels, so that the fifth ring could have a reserve of talents that could last for thousands of years, so that they could have time to find or plunder another large true cultivator realm. He was a little regretful, if only he had completely taken over the Hengi realm. Seeing that the time had come, he did not hesitate. Pass down the message, the rafts are to rise into the sky, and gather in the sky to wait. Chapter 23:23. It was the last 2 hours. There was only 1 hour left before the decision was made. At this time, all the preparations were in place. Whether they left or stayed, the outcome was set. Instead, at this time, the atmosphere became more relaxed. Friends, sect brothers, elders, everyone joked, chatted, and drank a few cups of wine. To those who disregarded life and death, and to those who had to carry the burden forward. Finally, there was no need to hesitate. Finally, they could open their hearts. Qin Yangzi looked at Qing Xian seriously. We old fellows will stand on our last shift, but not you. Your performance today is worthy of the 3 words, 3 pure ones. It's enough. It's unnecessary to persist any longer. This should be a matter for people like us. You and Little E have known each other for thousands of years. Why can't you learn how to be free and easy? Do you think that if he was in his current situation, he would walk the same path to the end? Qing Xian smiled. No. He would say, old fellows, take care. Forgive me for not sending you off. Do you have any wives or daughters to take care of? Your disciple is willing to serve you. But I'm not him. I'm me. Guan Du said regretfully, with your personality, you should come to the sword vein. Little E should go to the Taoist sect. Didn't he always boast about his talent in sorcery? He's already cultivated to the half-immortal level and can finally set fire. Chang Jin looked at his disciple. You're good. You have your own opinions. The key is to persevere. Don't care about what others think, even if it's our opinion. Whether you stay or leave this time, I'm very happy. 5 rings. There have never been so many outstanding people in one era. Is this the new era's gift to the universe's cultivation world? Unfortunately, we may not be able to see your glory. Shi's gaze was complicated. This was his master, but he had to part ways with him in the end. This was cultivation, right? If you couldn't step on the people in front of you, you would never be able to stand out. More and more rafts appeared outside the heaven and earth membrane. There were tens of thousands of them. This huge fleet was daunting to look at. Who would have thought that this was a fleet that was trying to escape? This was the first time that the Jin Dan Foundation establishment cultivators on the raft had come out of the atmosphere. They hadn't had the chance to experience the wonders of the universe yet, but the first thing they saw was the incomparably huge, ferocious, and terrifying black and white hole. At this distance, their vision was completely blocked. Apart from this terrifying pressure, they couldn't see anything else. Even though they were filled with the determination to fight to the death in the inner realm, when they saw the opponents the fifth ring cultivators were about to face, a strong sense of powerlessness rose in their hearts. Even the light in this strange hole was clearly distorted. They finally understood why the elders wanted them to evacuate. The history of human cultivation was a history of fighting against the heavens. Unfortunately, so far, it seemed that they hadn't been able to win. In the face of the vastness of the universe, no matter how many humans there were, they still seemed so insignificant. They were so insignificant that apart from this black and white hole, they couldn't even see a single star. All the rafts were increasing their power because if they didn't, they wouldn't need to control the raft. The rafts would be sucked into the black and white hole. Once they reached a critical point, it would be time for them to leave. The fifth ring behind them was still so beautiful, but on the heaven and earth membrane, more and more ripples began to appear. This was the effect of the hole's radiation. If it was so intense now, who knew what it would be like when they crashed into the hole? Time passed quickly, but it also passed slowly. What was fast was their mood. What was slow was their mood. She suddenly thought of a question. Senior brother, I heard that you've been in the fifth ring for dozens of years and have some gains? Why haven't I heard you mention it? Did you leave behind a male or female child? Qing Xian fiercely stared at him. I thought that since that guy wasn't here, no one would ask such a boring question. I didn't expect, she shrugged. Actually, I'm also very bored. A large group of perfected cultivators gathered. They were all older cultivators who were unwilling to wander in the universe's void. They automatically gathered behind Chang Jin and the other two. After the others left, they would be responsible for the defense of the fifth ring alone. There was no sadness. Every time there was a great war in the universe, they would gather like this. Then, they would send off batch after batch of old friends. Now it was their turn. This was the final destination of the people of the fifth ring. The farewells were over. More than half an hour had passed. It was almost time for the decision to be made, but the black spots in the hole were increasing. There were no signs of stopping. This wasn't a battle between cultivators. This was a battle between humans and nature. How could they save their trump card for last? Nature had heaven's secrets, but it didn't scheme. It followed the laws of nature, but it wouldn't do evil on purpose. Therefore, when dealing with it, one didn't have to worry about their methods being seen through by nature. One only had to consider whether the method was right. At least until now, Lu Xiaoyi hadn't found the right way to deal with it? Or had he already died in the hole? Chang Jin and a group of old cultivators were still excitedly discussing whether or not they would need to add a sharp cone in front of the grand membrane of heaven and earth. This would be able to effectively split apart a lot of energy radiation. Although the final result wouldn't be different, they still had to make themselves perfect. This was the last collision in their lives. No matter what, they had to make it grand, right? The perfected cultivators who were about to leave started to retreat slowly. It wasn't that they were in a hurry to leave, but some of the weaker Yuanying couldn't control the boat anymore. They couldn't help but be attracted by the hole. They needed help. The Jin Dan who built their foundation had the weakest endurance. This kind of parting was forever. Moreover, for their age, most of them still had family and friends in the mortal world. This kind of parting was forever. In the face of nature's punishment, humans weren't as strong as they thought. Qing Xian didn't seek the opinions of others anymore. The closer it was to the end, the more it needed an individual to make the decision. Your question caused countless difficulties. I order. The fleet of the fifth ring temporarily moved to the left. Wait! A voice suddenly interrupted him. It was Yan Cheng. This was very impolite behavior, and also very irrational behavior. For leaders like them, this was like magnifying the conflict in front of all the cultivators below them. The consequences would be immeasurable. From now on, this evacuation would become the fuse that caused the fifth ring to split. Qing Xian suppressed his dissatisfaction. He really didn't want to lose his temper, but at this moment, he couldn't tolerate such behavior. This included Shi and the other half-immortals and perfected cultivators. Why didn't you say anything earlier? Weren't you just causing trouble now? Yanqing didn't care. He pointed at the hole with a face full of anger. Take a look. If the hole is white as the base and black as the words, what can you see? Everyone looked over in surprise. In this mixed black and white pattern, it was like someone was scribbling on a piece of white paper. Although it was messy, it was clearly visible, a white hole turning into a black hole. The key was to use it diligently. Chapter 23-24. Full of ambiguity. What a dirty joke. Completely messing with you regardless of the occasion. But wasn't this the thing that a certain fellow with a wicked taste was best at? Smokey was still angry. Look, is this human language? To think that he's the #1 friend of women. He's a pervert in sheep's clothing. The three old men laughed loudly, and all the half-immortals let out a long breath. The perfected lords began to move, and the Foundation establishment Jean Dan were still somewhat confused, unable to react. How could this cave image make such a dirty joke? Qing Xian waved his hand. Order! Return to your original positions. Defend with all your strength. Those who leave without permission, behead. The human cultivators once again boiled over, but this time, the boiling mood was completely different. Because the cave image was under escort Lu's control. Although they didn't understand why he didn't make a move earlier? Although they didn't understand what would change in this short half an hour? Although they complained that this fellow didn't care about the occasion and had no sense of responsibility. But there was one thing they had to admit: escort Lu was still alive and well, and still had the leisure to make witty remarks. Then, in fact, this also meant that the cave image wasn't as frightening as it looked. The half-immortals didn't need to be told, and immediately sank into the grand membrane. With their support, the grand membrane would display a defensive toughness that far exceeded normal. How much radiation they could block would directly determine how many casualties there would be in the fifth ring. The perfected lords dived into the grand membrane and reorganized their great array system. The grand membrane would leak out, and it would all depend on how much they could eliminate. Not only did it affect humans, but it also affected the fifth ring's creatures and plants. The Yuanying were the most tired, because they still had to hurriedly dig into the realm, return to their respective cities, reorganize the regional formations, and release those Foundation establishment Jean Dan that made people worry. Although they were cursing and complaining, ridiculing their superiors' blind commands, and the torment of taking off their pants and releasing air, this was a happy complaint. The Foundation establishment Jean Dan were the happiest because they had returned. To them, they were the group that disapproved of giving up the mortals the most, because they hadn't truly come into contact with the core of cultivation. To the mortals, they had always been ignorant. It felt like the cultivators went up for a meeting, and then rushed back, messily fiddling around in the sky above the city. But no matter what, they had returned, and they were the most solid support of all mortals. Morale was just that strange. The month-long preparation had already worn down most of their morale. Then, when they gathered in the sky, their morale was almost gone. Now, it was the final radiance of the setting sun. The reinvigorated morale and reignited hope supported everyone to unleash their greatest potential. Looking from the sky, these middle and low-level cultivators completely understood what they were about to face. It was true that everyone had to participate in it. Everyone had their own value, even those at the bottom. 5 rings, in an instant, he returned to the state where he was covered in thorns all over his body and was a tough opponent. The old guys built a huge cone in the direction of the fifth ring road, Just like the ram of a huge ship, countless treasures filled the space. They didn't even have to consider the possibility of being damaged. All of them radiated with light. The black and white cave elephant that had once appeared sinister and terrifying in their eyes was nothing more than a big spotted dog that appeared fierce on the outside but was actually timid on the inside. Under such circumstances, the two behemoths finally collided after many days of approaching each other. It wasn't a physical collision, so there was no impact. The danger of the cave elephant was that it was everywhere, and there was nothing it couldn't penetrate. If there was no protection, half of the humans on the Fifth Ring Road would die in a day. The remaining half would also die intermittently in the following days. No one could escape. It was like a huge nuclear power plant leaking, like the tragedy of the residents around Chernobyl. This kind of radiation would become more and more intense as the Fifth Ring Road advanced in the cave elephant, until it reached the limit of protection. If the white hole didn't turn into a black hole, the Fifth Ring Road would slowly break away after reaching the peak of radiation and eventually pass through the cave elephant. If the cave elephant turned into a black hole, they would never be able to come out after entering. That was no longer a problem of radiation, it was also a problem of the atmosphere being stripped away, and it was also a problem of the bounded domain being torn apart. If it really reached that point, all protection would be meaningless. This was the reason why Qing Xian decisively requested the Fifth Ring cultivation world to evacuate when they didn't see any hope of the cave elephant being controlled. Of course, he didn't actually see any signs of the cave elephant changing for the better, but this was no longer important. His responsibility was to protect the bounded domain. The problem of the cave elephant belonged to Lu Xiaoyi. The division of labor was clear. More and more intense radiation shone on the macromembrane. The half-immortals had two choices. One was to completely block it. This would create a huge pressure on them and the macromembrane. As the bounded domain went deeper and deeper, it was hard to say whether it would reach a critical point and cause the macromembrane to collapse. They chose the second method. They didn't pursue completely blocking it, but intercepted most of the radiation and left the remaining small portion to the second and third layers below. The advantage of doing this was that the macromembrane would always have a certain amount of flexibility, and there would be no danger of the macromembrane collapsing. This was planned long ago. In terms of defense, the Taoist cultivators were very experienced. They could always find the most suitable method and persevere. They were full of tenacity. The heaven and earth great formation that the Supremes set up during the macromembrane's internal testing began to show its effect. Fortunately, they didn't need to guard against direct collisions. If the danger only came from radiation, they could choose a formation that was relatively targeted. In this aspect, there were countless similar great formations in Taoist studies. With this collision, the foundation of a bounded domain was revealed. In this aspect, the Fifth Ring cultivators weren't inferior to any of the Taoist orthodoxies of the universe. Right now, they had just entered the cave image, and the pressure was still under control. The third layer of defense below, the Yuanying City defense, didn't feel any pressure, not to mention the fourth layer of defense, the Jin Dan, and the fifth layer of foundation establishment. However, no one would lower their guard. After seeing that terrifying cave image with their own eyes, even the foundation establishment knew that it would be their turn sooner or later. In the eyes of the mortals, although it was night, the sky was abnormally bright. It was as if there was an aurora flashing in the sky. That was the evaporation of the macromembrane under the intense radiation. Whatever was destroyed, the 40 half-immortals would replenish until the speed of their replenishment couldn't keep up with the evaporation of the radiation. There was also the Supreme's heaven and earth great formation. This was the most obvious light source in the atmosphere. It was like a shining water shield, firmly covering the macromembrane, not allowing a single trace of radiation to pass through. When the collision started, It displayed a shocking wonder of heaven and earth. It made all the mortals aware of the intensity of the macro-membrane. Other than praying, they were powerless. Chapter 23-25. As the host, Qing Xian was constantly observing the changes of the cave image. What puzzled him was that the transformation of the cave image was still going on. Even though he knew that the bastard was in the depths of the cave image, he could not help but be enraged by the leisurely transformation. There was a principle that could not be changed. When half of the cave image was black, the transformation would be irreversible. Now that they were not far from this boundary, the black color had already occupied 40% of the cave image. There was not much time left for the bastard. Still not exerting force? Still pretending? He was angry because things had already reached this stage. The 5 rings did not even have room to maneuver. Those Yuanying could not bring the young cultivators away. Because at the current distance, the Yuanying could not escape the attraction of the cave image. If they continued forward, even the perfected Lord could not escape. Until even these half-immortals could not escape. Even though almost everyone was full of confidence, this was an overdraft of a certain person's past glory. It was not a realistic and rational analysis. That bastard had an extraordinary ability to stir up trouble. He could always use a completely irrelevant sentence to stir up everyone's emotions. It made people fall into madness. But the true attitude of a cultivator was respect for nature, reverence for the universe, and not unconditional blind trust in a certain person with an extraordinary past. There were too many such cases in the cultivation world. They did not believe in facts but blindly followed the legends of authority. In the end, they brought disaster to themselves and their own orthodoxy. What was worse was that Qing Xian was the biggest accomplice to the evildoer. This was the final decision he made blindly. Working with this person was enough to drive people crazy. Just like now, that guy had pulled everyone into a huge gamble. The opponent's trump card was the leopard, but this guy was holding the dice cup and not opening it. He only knew how to scratch his head and flirt, looking around complacently. There was also bad news. Because she was good at formations, he had been organizing the defense of the heaven and earth macromembrane, so he immediately gave a warning. The intensity of the radiation is much higher than expected. Even if we have already started to divert the pressure to the perfected Lord's heaven and earth formation. But you know, their stopping power is limited and cannot exceed a certain limit. I suspect that before we reach the deepest part of the cave image, the radiation will affect the lives of the mortals in the domain. There is not much time left. The limit of the macromembrane will be reached soon. Qing Xian did not hesitate. Your responsibility is to not collapse the first line of defense. Do your best without collapsing. As for whether the bottom line can withstand it or not, that is another matter. It was cruel, but the most rational choice. If the heaven and earth grand membrane controlled by the half-immortals collapsed, the 4 lines of defense below would be completely meaningless. He could only choose to let more of the radiation pass through and then block it in layers. As for whether the lower layers could completely block it and how much damage the mortals would suffer, he could only leave it to fate. It was better than everyone suddenly being exposed to strong radiation. The true monarch's heaven and earth great array could no longer withstand the pressure. They had no choice but to transmit the pressure to the next level. The sky above the tens of thousands of cities in the 5th Ring Road suddenly shone brightly. Although they had passed through 2 levels of blockage, the immense pressure of radiation was still suffocating the nascent soul stage cultivators. After holding on for less than a quarter of an hour, traces of radiation had already penetrated their formation cover and shone into the city. As a result, the entire city was lit up with countless lights. All of the golden core and foundation establishment cultivators brought out their best weapons, formations, and defenses, all for the sake of being the last line of defense. There was no target. They did not know when it would end. They would just hold on until they were exhausted and their dantian was empty. This damn thing. Qing Xian, who was always calm, could not help but curse. He did not have any backup plan now. He could only bet on that guy's personal performance. There was still no obvious change. The cave image unswervingly changed to black and white balance. Under the fearful gazes of all the half-immortals and perfected lords, it stopped at a state of complete balance. Then it stopped moving. But this did not mean that it was safe. It was just a premonition. In the next moment, the cave image would no longer change slowly. It would instantly turn into a real black hole and swallow everyone. They had persevered for so long just for this? If all of this was destined to be meaningless, then what were they doing? They were like a bunch of clowns in front of a heavenly phenomenon. This was the most torturous wait. They were waiting for the cave image's death god to suddenly change its face. And besides enduring, they did not have the slightest ability to resist. Some of the perfected lords with weaker minds had already started to give up. This was a dangerous sign. Once such emotions spread, there was no need to wait for the black hole to form. The radiation would kill all the fifth ring cultivators. Yan Cheng stood up and released his divine sense. Persevere. Persevere. The fifth ring cultivators have existed for tens of thousands of years for only one reason: persevere. We have endured tens of thousands of years of pressure and countless universe wars. The only reason we have survived until now is never give up. Qing Xian, Shi Shi, Qing Yangzi, Chang Jin, Guandu, Tong Yen, and the half-immortals. All the strong-willed cultivators spoke in unison, causing a single word to vibrate in the void. They shouted themselves hoarse, their voices stern, as if they had gone mad. Persevere, persevere, persevere. Even if it was the last breath of life, persevere still had meaning. This was the spirit of the fifth ring cultivators. Under their inspiration, the heaven and earth great barrier, the heaven and earth great array, the city's area array, the pitiful defense of the small cultivators, everyone was persevering, doing their best. Persevere. 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 Waiting for the inevitable black hole to form. Persevere. 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 Not for anything, but for the spirit of the fifth ring cultivators. Persevere. 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 The meaning of life was that we had fought to the end. Persevere. 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 It seemed to have entered the core of the cave image. The great barrier did not collapse. The heaven and earth great array did not collapse. The radiation intensity was also abnormal, and did not increase. The black and white cave image was still balanced. It swayed on the critical point of transforming into a black hole in an instant, but it did not shake out of that step. It was like a death row prisoner had already knelt down, his neck stretched out, and the executioner's knife was already raised, but it did not fall. It was still persevering. This was already the final perseverance of the fifth ring cultivators. Then, the fifth ring domain silently passed through the core of the cave image, and began to fly to the other side. Shi Shi shouted wildly, "The radiation intensity is beginning to weaken. We are leaving. We are safe." Little E, that bastard, set the cave image at the critical point of the gray hole. That son of a bitch, giving birth is not giving birth. Isn't this just scaring people? Everything was clear now. For some reason, Escort Lu did not choose to reverse the conversion between black and white. Instead, he chose the most dangerous gray hole. Therefore, they were really safe. Chapter 23-26. Lu Xiaoyi heaved a long sigh of relief when he felt the pressure slowly fading away. It was not that he had to put up a brave front, but even with the ability of 3 small holes, he could not reverse the situation. This was not something a human could do. He could feel that the fifth ring had left, but he did not dare to leave immediately. Although in theory, there was no possibility of the cave image turning into a black hole and pulling the fifth ring back after he left, it was always better to be careful. Besides, he also needed a stable environment to finalize his body. To be precise, he would be laughed at and treated as a monster if he went out now. Because a mouth was a black hole, and a fart was a white hole, he had to find a balance. He had no other choice, and the gray hole was his only choice. Therefore, he needed more time to familiarize himself with it. It was also a good time to monitor the direction of the cave image. It took a lot of effort to control the cave image at the last moment. It could not be said that he controlled it, but it could be more accurate to say that he influenced it. For this, he had already done his best. Would he consider the loss of the fifth ring? How big was the loss? After cultivating for 3,000 years, he understood a lot of things. Even if he really became Hong in the future, he could not protect the safety of all humans. There would still be collisions between celestial bodies, and there would still be natural phenomena that would harm humans. This could not be avoided, and should not be avoided. This world was a world where humans and nature competed. You could only talk about how many humans were killed by the tyranny of nature, because you were a human and looked at the problem from a human's point of view. But who would look at the problem from the point of view of nature? Since the beginning of the history of cultivation, how much nature had been destroyed by humans? Only more, not less. Then, who would nature look for? This was a competition, an eternal melody. When humans completely controlled nature, it would be the precursor to the destruction of the universe. Because nature in the universe did not have ambition, but humans did. He had already done his best in this encounter with the cave image. He had worn the fifth ring nearly 100 years ago, and then guarded the fifth ring for 100 years. When everyone was not optimistic about his warning, he still stood his ground. In the end, for the safety of the fifth ring, he risked entering the cave image's depth. Therefore, he felt at ease. The important thing was that he had a clear conscience during this process. As for the loss, that was another matter. He would not hurt himself for this, not at all. He was not an immortal and could not do what immortals did. Furthermore, immortals might not be able to do it, and might not be willing to do it. In a sense, he had already hindered the progress of nature to a certain extent. This was not necessarily a good thing. Fortunately, chaos was the main theme before the dawn of the new era. Lu Xiaoyi fixed himself in the cave image with a clear conscience. His original intention was only to modify his body to be more stable. However, this kind of mending was easy to think of but troublesome to do. Previously, because he was greedy for speed, he needed to quickly harmonize with the cave image. Thus, he had been very careless in the small areas. Now that the outside world was safe, he naturally had to consider the safety of his own life. After a series of meticulous carving, several months quickly passed. Cultivation knows no time. It wasn't until one day, when he felt that his body had reached a whole new level. He had completely transformed into a brand new body refinement body. Only then did he begin to consider the problem of how to get out. Over the past few months, he had gained two rewards. One was his fleshly body, and the other was his devouring Tao realm. This allowed him to take another step forward. Where should he go? Currently, there were two options. One was the land of the Yellow Dragon, and the other was the Heaven's Choice continent. Of course, going to the land of the Yellow Dragon was to erect a monument. Going to the Heaven's Choice continent was for the way of the sword. At his current level, he could already reach out to Li Wuya in all aspects. This was also what he had been looking forward to. With a thought in his mind, his body bent and bounced. He did not need to move, but relied on the two holes to move forward, just like the inlet and outlet of a jet. Of course, what he was swallowing now was not air, but rays. To be honest, this method of moving was very strange. The speed was not slow, but it was a little disgusting to use. It even had to be paired with open crotch pants. It was not suitable to be used in broad daylight, but it had a special effect in special environments. For example, in the cave image, it was the best way to move. In fact, he could directly go out from the wormhole. With the deep understanding of the cave image that he had gained over the past few months, it was not difficult to directly break through the wall of the wormhole. However, he had other thoughts. He wanted to go out from the other end, which was the side that originally belonged to the black hole, the other end of the entire cave image trinity. This was not meaningless, but it could help him figure out the origin of the young realm. Where exactly was it swallowed from? What was the mother body that belonged to the young realm? Which celestial body was it in? In these situations, it was difficult for him to find out after he left the normal space of the universe. The most convenient way was to go directly through the wormhole, and then appear at the location of the black hole, which was also the gray hole now. The significance of doing this was to thoroughly understand whether there would be any sequelae left behind by the existence of the young domain in the future of the fifth ring. He also had a target to monitor. Even if he viewed danger as normal, he was not willing to go through such a frightening moment again. He was a person who looked carefree on the surface, but in fact, he was very careful when he did things. The universe was facing a huge change. To what extent would such a huge change affect the countless celestial bodies throughout the universe? Were there any special rules in this? These were all things that a responsible major cultivator should know. The reason was that the trajectory of the fifth ring was too erratic. It was not like most of the known celestial bodies that would revolve around a certain star, nor was it fixed in a specific galaxy. To put it simply, he still could not figure out what it was revolving around. Or was it simply moving freely? Because it was not in a certain galaxy, and there was no huge star to provide gravitational protection for it, it could not circulate in a fixed trajectory under a strong gravitational force, so it was full of uncertainty. In fact, for the fifth ring, the problem of how to protect the domain really had to be put on the agenda. In the next 1 to 2,000 years, he might spend most of his time in the land of the Yellow Dragon, and there would be very few opportunities for him to come back. Some things had to be done in advance. At the very least, he should provide such a direction, and let the fifth ring cultivators consciously study and decipher in this direction. This was the attitude that a cultivator should have. From now on, he was solving his own worries. Without any scruples, he could go all out in the land of the Yellow Dragon. He did not know how other people arranged their own affairs, but he thought that they would not be as tired as him. This was the path that he had chosen. He had already entered the fast lane and could no longer stop. Chapter 23-27. The West Sea, a sea in the western elephant sky. Of course, this was just an adjective. A sea was so large that it was often used to connect several continents in a domain. The fact that it could be called a sea in the universe showed how big it was. In the western elephant sky, it was an airspace of close to 100 universes. The cultivation world had its own way of dividing each universe. It was not an equal division, and there was no possibility of artificial differentiation between different three-dimensional spaces. The principle here was that it was a step-by-step principle based on the form of energy. The spread of energy in the universe would weaken, related to distance, environment, and so on. However, this decrease was a smooth curve. If there was no artificial interference, the waves of a spell would become weaker as they spread further and further in the universe. This was the consumption of energy over distance. It was a natural principle. However, in the real universe there was a step-by-step decrease. It was like a person swimming in the sea suddenly feeling a chill in his stomach. The temperature was completely different from the surroundings. Excluding the accidental reason of a shark passing under him, it basically meant one thing. He might be passing through a dark trench at the bottom of the sea. The universe was the same. It was just that humans could not feel it, but the form of energy could be clearly expressed. For example, if a shock wave traveled in the universe according to the normal principle of step-by-step decrease, the energy would become less and less as time passed. However, when it crossed a completely unmarked boundary, there would suddenly be a step-by-step decrease. In the cultivation world, this line, or this boundary, was called the boundary between different universes. To put it simply, when the shock wave suddenly decreased in a step-by-step manner, it meant that it had arrived at another universe. There were no similar energy traps or dark trenches in this airspace. Moreover, it was strangely large as 100 universes. It did not seem appropriate to call it another universe. Hence, it was called a sea in the universe. It was also the largest sea in the western elephant sky. If there was a sea, there would naturally be islands. Realms and celestial bodies of various sizes were scattered all over the place. In the western elephant sky, it was also an important birthplace for cultivation culture to flourish. Of course, it was the birthplace of Buddhism, the Western Elephant Heaven. It was impossible for Taoism to establish a sect in such a place with good feng shui. In Western Elephant Heaven, there were two representative orthodoxies of Buddhism. One was the small Sumer realm. Lu Xiaoyi had been to this place before and stayed there for a period of time. They had a good relationship and were part of the moderate faction of Buddhism. The inner realm hands-free came from this place and could be considered half a friend. The other was the great sage heavens. Lu Xiaoyi had also come into contact with it, but the one he had come into contact with was a great Buddha of Sun God of the 5 dynasties. Because of the Crimson Star, there had been a lot of fights between the two of them. They belonged to the Buddhist forces that had grudges against each other. The great holy heavens had taken root in the Western Ocean. It was through this place that they extended their tentacles to the entire Western Elephant Heaven. In the center of the West Sea, there was an immortal mountain named Boundless Mountain. It was named after the meaning of the boundless Buddha Sea. It was the foundation that supported the hundreds of human cultivation worlds in the West Sea. In fact, it was also a world that looked like a mountain. Because it had no atmosphere, there were no humans living there. However, its importance was reflected in other aspects. The spiritual energy level of the hundreds of worlds in the West Sea was closely related to Boundless Mountain. A kind of inductive spiritual energy resonance with Boundless Mountain as its heart surged and stimulated the spiritual energy level of the surrounding cultivation world. Among them, the one that resonated the most harmoniously was one of the 2 pillars of Buddhism in the Western Elephant Heaven, the Great Sage Heavens. Due to its geographical location and its position as the source of spiritual energy in the West Sea, the people here called it the Heart of the Sea. This was an incomparable respect for it. It was an important place in the West Sea that could not be violated. However, in the past few months, many of the highest-level great Buddhas of the West Sea had gathered around Boundless Mountain, including the Bodhis who had returned from the inner and outer realm. The Taoists called the next level of sun god half-immortals, while the Buddhists called them Bodhis. However, the Taoists had the advantage in numbers, so, in the West Sea, other than the Great Sage Heavens, there were 2 other wonders. The first was Boundless Mountain in the heart of the sea. This was the source of prosperity for the entire West Sea cultivation world. However, under the heavenly Tao, everything was fair. For a place like the West Sea where spiritual energy flourished, of course, it could not be filled with auspicious signs. It was a place called the Eye of the Sea. It was actually a huge black hole that threatened the existence of the entire West Sea cultivation world at all times. However, no one could say that this thing was useless. It had to be destroyed as soon as possible. In the universe, where there was light, there was darkness. Where there was reality, there was void. Where there was safety, there was danger. They all complemented each other. One could not blindly pursue perfection and wish that the surroundings were filled with auspicious signs. If that was the case, one would not be far from death. It could only be seen as a psychological burden in the subconscious mind of every cultivator in the West Sea. Moreover, even the Buddhists could not get rid of it. As for the high and mighty immortals, they would not care about such things. They would say, "Oh, you want to move away just because the black hole is a threat? Then do you want me to help you get rid of all the black holes in the universe to make you feel safe? Taoists are more dangerous than black holes. Do you want me to help you kill all the Taoist cultivators in the West Elephant Heavens?" Therefore, since the beginning of the West Sea, there had been this black hole in the eye of the sea. For millions of years, it had caused a lot of trouble for the various realms in the West Sea. It had also swallowed some unimportant realms. In the West Sea cultivation world, it was a celestial phenomenon. This black hole in the eye of the sea and boundless mountain in the heart of the sea formed the legend of the West Sea. Countless realms were created, and countless joys and sorrows were recorded in it. The history of the West Sea cultivation was actually the history of these two wonders. Even the great sage heavens, the Buddhist holy land of the humans, was only developed later. It was a product of the boundless mountain. It was this black hole that seemed to have started to mutate in recent months. If it was only targeting unimportant realms, it would not be a big deal. After millions of years, it had already swallowed many realms. It did not matter if it swallowed another one. With the power of the West Sea's Buddhist sects, they could completely control the damage to the minimum. For example, if it was a human realm, they could easily transfer the population. They could just treat it as feeding a vicious shark in the West Sea. But the problem was, this vicious shark's target this time seemed to be Boundless Mountain? This made it difficult for people to remain calm. If something happened to Boundless Mountain, the spiritual vigor of the hundreds of cultivation realms in the West Sea would drop. How could they tolerate this? Therefore, the virtuous eminent monks of the West Sea gathered here regardless of their distance. There were even dozens of Bodhi monks who came to contribute to their home sea. However, there were many people gathered here, almost 20% of the people in the West Elephant Heavens, but they were helpless against a colossus like the cave elephant. Not only the great Buddhas, but also the Bodhi monks. This was beyond the scope of their abilities. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.